Right, good morning everybody and welcome to this meeting of Cambridgeshire County Council's Environment and Green Investment Committee. We have a thrilling series of reports in front of you and interesting discussions to be had, I am sure. So strap in for the ride and let's get started. I need to start by giving you the following announcement, which is to welcome those members of the public and press who've joined us today remotely. Fortunately, the Zoom link appears to have held up despite yesterday's technical problems with underground cables or some such, but we appear to be live and kicking today. The County Council allows filming and photography at its public meetings, so please feel free to take pictures and tweet during the meeting. May I ask, though, that everyone present turns their mobile phones to silent or vibrate while the meeting is taking place. Thank you. Please be aware that this meeting is being live streamed and that a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the County Council's website. There is no fire alarm test scheduled for today, so if the alarm sounds, it will be the real thing, and I will adjourn the meeting and we will all make our way downstairs and out of the main entrance. The muster point is on the green opposite the main entrance. I propose to waive the committee procedure rule limiting members' contributions to the debate. However, we have a lot of business to get through today, so I would ask all members to keep their contributions concise. The meeting room has been arranged to comply with public health guidance on COVID safety, and in line with their latest advice, committee members and officers are asked to remove their face coverings only when they're speaking and to wear masks for the remainder of the time. So we start with apologies for absence. So could the Democratic Services Officer please report any apologies for absence?
We have apologies from Councillor Tierney.
Thank you very much indeed. And does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? No? So in that case, we'll move on to the minutes, and we're being asked to approve the minutes of the meeting of the 16th of December as an accurate record. If any committee member wants to raise a question on the accuracy of the minutes only, can they please do so now? Councillor Bradnam.
Sorry, I was a bit slow off the mark there. We're looking at the local plan, the Greater Cambridge local plan, at item 7, first proposals, and I need to declare that I'm a district councillor for that purpose.
Right, okay, thank you. That is noted. So the minutes of the meeting then, are we content to approve them for accuracy? I'm not seeing any dissent, so let us do that. And then an updated action log was also included in the published papers for this meeting. Are there any questions on the action log, or can we take it as noted? I'm not seeing any questions, so we will take that as noted then. And I'm told that we've received no petitions or public questions. So then we get on to the first substantive item, which is the annual carbon footprint of Cambridgeshire County Council and of Cambridgeshire as a county. So can I please ask Sarah Wilkinson, Energy Manager, to present this report?
Thank you. So the purpose of this report is to present a summary of the Council's greenhouse gas emissions for the year 2020 to 21, to enable monitoring of progress against our climate change targets and increase our understanding of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions across the county and from council activities. So firstly, I'd like to make a quick note about county-wide emissions. The published data from BEIS, which covers CO2 emissions by local authority area, has been revised significantly since the previous year's publication, with the largest differences being from methodology improvements in the land use change and forestry, abbreviated as LUCF sector. In Cambridgeshire, CO2 emissions per capita and per kilometre squared were considerably higher than the national average, with much of the excess due to that land use sector. And this can be seen clearly on that map that I've put in the appendix for report, where much of Cambridgeshire is in that red and orange area, meaning land use is a source of CO2 emissions, where the green areas are a net sink. Aside from land use, other sectors show a slight decline in emissions year on year, a similar trend to other parts of the country. Now, on to the Council's own emissions. It's fair to say that 2020 to 21 was an exceptionally unusual year, and this is reflected in our greenhouse gas emissions. You'll no doubt notice that the total emissions figure of 113,000 tonnes for all scopes is significantly less than last year's total, where we reported over 200,000 tonnes. The vast majority of this difference is due to a reduction in construction activity from major capital building works, such as building new schools. And this particular activity, which was 95,000 tonnes CO2 equivalent in the previous year, was less than 5,000 in 20 to 21, a massive 95% reduction. And that is largely due to the impact of COVID and also just the programme of works of that year, what happened to be on site. So unfortunately, is not likely to be a permanent reduction. This reduced construction activity means that waste is now the biggest source of our emissions for that year, at 35% of all known emissions, mainly due to landfill emissions from household waste, and that bit is very similar to the previous year. Another change for this year is that I've been able to include in the council total an estimate of emissions from land use for the first time for the council's own emissions. This is based on the area of land that the council own and emissions factors calculated from the UK greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which adds 24,000 tonnes CO2 equivalent to our total. Transport is also showing a big reduction. Transport emissions were down by 62%, over 10,000 tonnes the previous year to around 4,000, largely due to reduced activity because of COVID and unfortunately likely to rebound again for the next year's report. And finally, if we look at scopes 1 and 2 only, the emissions from our own assets, these emissions were 20% lower than last year. And this is partly due to the UK electricity grid getting greener, partly due to us using less gas for heating with the mild winter last year, and less electricity for street lighting too. A bit of the reduction was also due to less fleet transport activity because of COVID. So although there are many reasons for these reductions, a lot of the other projects that we're working on, we will start to see the impact of those in following years' reports. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. It's an excellent and really interesting report. I'm going to start by asking members for any questions for Sarah to start off with. Questions only at this stage. Councillor Bradnam first and then Councillor Goldsack.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just noting that, as you said, Sarah, that many of our reductions in carbon use have been as a result of the pandemic, and that's not going to be an ongoing situation. So I wondered whether we had done an audit of the Balfour Beatty contract for street lighting and whether that had actually, prior to the pandemic, actually reduced our carbon use, our use of electricity, because part of that was to put in LED bulbs which use less electricity. I just wondered whether an audit had been done of how effective that was.
Thank you. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I do know that the electricity usage from street lighting has reduced, and especially whether that's a combination of the swap to LED lighting, or whether there was any change to the number of lights or the hours of operation, I'm not sure.
There was also 1 in 10 reduction in the number of, was it 1 in 10? In the reduction of the number of street lamps as well. So just, not for now, but I wondered if we could have a report on that, or just a response, a written response would be helpful.
So that definitely would have reduced our emissions, and I've got in my report the total emissions for street lighting, and I can compare that to previous years.
Thank you very much. Sarah, I just noticed that if you turn your head, you're not speaking into the microphone. Tempting as it is to turn to look at the person who's asked you the question, I think it's probably better if you appear slightly less than sociable and face the microphone. Councillor Goldsack.
Thank you, Chair. I largely back up what's been said. It's a really good report. Couple of things I think that could make it an excellent report. Your point 1.1 says that you're aiming for 50% reduction in scope 1 by 2023. In the narrative, you say that we're at 20%, so we've got 30% more to find this year. I just think that and the list of 100 actions would have been good in the report to have seen a progress versus plan. We don't really know other than digging it out. It could have been a very simple display or explanation of our progress versus our plan, particularly on the 100 actions. That's an awful lot of actions to read through and understand when we could have known. But I would be interested to know the plans to make up that effectively. You said yourself that 20% was largely caused by external forces, as in the COVID shutdown and lack of stuff. And we've got to make up an awful lot more this year as to how we're going to do it. You don't have to look round.
Thank you. It just feels strange having my back to everyone. Yeah, I'll make a note of that. I don't know if I have an immediate answer to that question. I think Cheryl might want to come in on that point. That's Cheryl?
It's a good point. So that the difference between reporting just what the emissions are showing now compared to what interventions we've implemented over the last year to demonstrate those reductions, and what actions we're going to take to get to the point of 50% reduction. So I think it would be reasonable that we could probably put together a couple of pages to send round over the next month to members to just show how the actions that have been taken have showed or delivered those reductions. But we'll have that in mind for future on how we report.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor King and Councillor Hathorn.
Thank you. Yeah, so in the report it says there are a number of gaps in the information. Correct me if I've missed it, but I just want to better understand what's being done to plug those gaps so we've got all the information that we need. Thank you.
I would start by saying that we're already reporting quite a lot more of things within scope compared to not just other local authorities, but also other organisations in general, many of which only report their scope 1 and 2. So the fact that we do already include a lot of scope 3 suggests that we might have less gaps than many others. Nonetheless, we do recognise that there are still more that we can do to fill in some more of those gaps. And one example of that is the land use data that I've included this year, which we weren't able to do last year. I'm also working with colleagues from several other departments in trying to fill some of those data gaps as best we can. But I think we also have to accept we'll never get all of the data because some of it lies with other organisations outside of our direct control.
Well, can I just add on to that? So there is work as well going on procurements. So how you get data via our procurements that we're running over the subsequent years, and ensuring that we specify for that data, because one of the challenges is getting data when you haven't specified that previously.
Thank you. Councillor Hathorn.
So the recommendation for this report is to publish it on the Council's climate change pages on the website. When I look at the website, the previous reports aren't there, and I think it would be I think there's a little reference to historic performance, but I'd like to know how it's going. Yeah, in what form is the report just going to be published, or is it going to stay there so that subsequent reports can be referred to in future? What will that look like?
I'm pretty sure they are there, so I can find a link and check that right now.
If you can do that quickly, that's helpful. Otherwise, it's fine just to send a note round to members afterwards and indicate where they are. Yeah.
I just add, so Councillor Hathorn, we published the last 2, so unless anything's changed, they were on the website. Perhaps they're just slightly buried. So we might need to look at how we can highlight that a bit more. But the intention is to have each year published on the website. So external organisations can review what we're doing and the progress we're making.
And you wanted to come back?
Yes, just I struggled to find them. So if we could just make absolutely sure they can be really clear to find, that'd be really helpful.
Thank you very much. Councillor Gay.
So I think it's clear from your report that the land use change and forestry piece of this is the most intractable. And at the moment, we don't have a sort of coherent policy for addressing that. Is it the intention that we will develop such a policy over the next few years? Because we can see that it's not changed at all since 2005, basically. And what do you think the prospects for that? Or is it even fair to Cambridgeshire to keep that element in our carbon targets?
Joe, it's very difficult to hear the Vice Chair.
Do you want me to repeat?
I can hear the question, but I'm not sure if I'm the right person to answer it. Can I defer to Cheryl on this one?
Yeah.
So you're identifying the issue, a policy issue, which is what have we set in terms of policy for our land use or our rural estates? And I would say that I think there's a lot of work ongoing with our colleagues in rural estates on identifying nature-based solutions, working with tenants, working with the combined authority. And I think it's an evolving position, which I hope in the next couple of years we will get a much stronger policy position. The issue of peat is, I think, a big benefit that we have, because we are obviously an area which, unlike many other areas, we have significant levels of peat. And so there's a lot of data and evidence that is being gathered at the moment just on the quality of that before we can make decisions. But I do hope that we can see it as a positive.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Coots.
Just like to welcome the inclusion this year. Although it's a bit depressing to see our area going orange and red, at least it's good to know what the situation is if we're hoping to address it. So thank you.
Sure, that was a question, but yes. I had a question for you, Sarah, if I may. I put some information up on social media about the fact that we were having this debate today and about some work that I did using the impact tool to produce parish level reports, which have generated more interest than I thought, actually. So there's been some quite lively debates, particularly around the contribution of shipping in the Sutton division, which surprised us rather. But the first question I got was about land use change and forestry, actually, and whether we were using the latest methodology on that and what the changes in methodology were, which, you know, is an interesting question to ask. But in addition to that, the other question was, there are changes in our footprint year on year, which are out of our control, sometimes because they are intractable things, but sometimes because there are changes in methodology, and also sometimes because we just have a very unusual year, as you rightly pointed out in the report. And I wondered two things. Firstly, how we make that comprehensible and clear to the public when we present the reports and put them on the website and people can see year on year what's happening, how we present that picture and what's under our control and what isn't, but also how we, in effect, smooth that out for ourselves. I mean, in my sad life, I subscribe to the Office of National Statistics blog, and so I get regular emails about that. And I noticed for at least one purpose, they are having to discount 2020 when they take 5-year averages, which is what they've been doing for some calculations, because it was so unusual. It was going to make all sorts of other issues really difficult into the 5 years hence, where things would look as if they were that things were normal when in fact they were not. So I wondered whether you had given thought to how we might look at presenting that picture, because if we've got an artificial dip this year, we'll get an artificial rise next year, and that'll look really bad. How do we get that consistent picture of how things are actually doing over the medium term rather than year on year?
Thank you. Yes, it's a really interesting question. And I think there's a couple of things that feed into that. One is the thing about what is under our control and what isn't under our control. And I think the main way we distinguish that is within the scopes of reporting. So we divide our emissions into scopes 1, 2, and 3. So scope 1, for those who might not be familiar with this, is emissions from an organisation's direct assets like its own buildings and fleet vehicles. Scope 2 is emissions from electricity use, broadly, and scope 3 is everything else, all the indirect emissions from contractors and suppliers, employees, customers, and other things that are indirect result of an organisation's activities. So I think that's one way where we distinguish what's in our control and what isn't. Another part of your question was about how we explain changes year on year. And I think there's part of that is in the narrative of the accompanying report, where we've done some explanations of why these figures are what they are. And part of it is also how we present trends over time. So that might be through, I've put some graphs into the appendix report to include a 3-year trend. This is only the 3rd year we've done this report, and I will continue to do things like that, but I'm always open to other ways of presenting data if people would find that helpful.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. Councillor Milnes.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to pick up on that point, I find myself strangely wanting to see more PowerPoint. I think there's a really good case, and Councillor Goldsack referred to this, to a public presentation, or for those of us on the committee who haven't got time to deep dive into the data that's in the report, which is all there. I mean, it's very comprehensive, but it's really too big an elephant to eat. And I think for our public, they want to be able to see, 3 or 4 infographic slides that explain how we're doing, and if we've got anomalous data, which is created by the pandemic, then we ought to be able to illustrate how we're dealing with that blip in the data. So thank you.
Thank you. Again, I'm not sure that was a question, but I'm happy to refer that to Sarah and Cheryl to take away and think about. I agree that there is huge public interest in this, and I was really pleased to see the engagement that I got just from talking, telling people we were going to be discussing this today and looking at their own villages' carbon footprint estimates, including the shipping. Right, okay, I think that was the questions. So we'll now move on to the debate, and the recommendations are to accept the annual carbon footprint report as a record of the Council's greenhouse gas emissions for the financial year April 2020 to March 2021, and to publish the report on the Council's climate change pages on the website. So I'm going to propose that and ask my Vice Chair to second. Thank you very much indeed. So I'll open this for debate. Councillor Goldsack.
It's just to follow up on mine and Councillor Milne's point, really. I have absolutely no problem in agreeing to this. I think it's the right thing to do. But whether we need to amend B or add a C to make it more definable, which I think is what Councillor Milne's pointed out. We're not crying out for PowerPoint, but I do get the point, where, the measure of progress against targets would be an awful lot of people, as you've said, Chair, an awful lot of people with an awful lot of interest in this. Let's make it as simple and as easy for them to understand as we possibly can.
Thank you. I think you're too late for a formal amendment to the recommendations, Councillor Goldsack, but we've certainly indicated that we would be very pleased indeed for officers to take that away and work with whoever to consider how we make this information accessible and really zing, because I think the public are increasingly interested in what's going on in the field of carbon emissions and climate change. Are there any other speakers I don't see any other. So yes, I think we've all agreed that this is an excellent report and getting better, I think, year on year. Very grateful indeed to Sarah for all her ongoing hard work, and indeed the whole of Cheryl's team who continue to do a fantastic job for us. So can I see those in favour of the recommendations, please? And that is unanimous. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Sarah. Right, our next item then is 2 research reports from our CUSPI researchers. That's the Cambridge University Science and Policy Exchange, which is a scheme that has been ongoing for a number of years, where students from the University of Cambridge assist us by, and themselves, by working together on issues that we as a council pitch to them, ideas, suggestions, things that we would like a bit of thought about, a bit of help with. And it's not only really good for us, it's also good for them and for their career development. So it's a fantastic scheme. I'm not sure that we actually have a champion for this, as we used to have in the very redoubtable Councillor Manning, who was very invested in this. I don't know whether that's something we need to think about, but it's a fantastic scheme. And we have 2 reports. So I'm going to hand over to Cheryl French at this stage and ask her to introduce the first report, which is on a Cambridgeshire Decarbonisation Fund, and to introduce the researchers who've been working on this and are hopefully not only visible, but also will be audible on Zoom. So Cheryl.
Thank you, Councillor Dupre, and morning researchers. So just before the researchers do a 10-minute presentation for you on the Cambridgeshire Decarbonisation Fund, there's a couple of things I just want to note before we start. So the researchers are not paid consultants. They've given up time out of their busy schedules completing PhDs. And part of that process was to try and build skills, as Councillor Dupre alluded to, but also to give insights into how local authorities work and how we develop policy. And a lot of the researchers have scientific backgrounds, but they don't necessarily have science backgrounds in environmental policy, as an example. So it's just to remember that context ahead of their presentations. The work that has been undertaken on the Cambridgeshire Decarbonisation Fund is building on a CUSPI project from last year, which you might remember. So the researchers have used the first year's report and then taken that into further detail. And the focus has been really on how do we support businesses? What do we do to get carbon credits that businesses will be happy to pay for? And what could the fund model look like? And most importantly, after their presentation, I think the thing that we want to discuss at that stage, and is under the recommendations in paragraph 2.8, is what are the next steps for this work? We're keen to have the discussions on the Carbon Advisory Service with the Combined Authority, our local authority partners, and also the business board that currently runs, to see whether we can progress that work. The other part is we'll want to get the Swaffham Prior Community Heat Project accredited. So we have a first project in Cambridgeshire where carbon credits can be sold potentially on the market to the businesses. And the third bit is about how we're going to progress the discussions around the decarbonisation funding model and how this fits within the ambitions across Cambridgeshire and the financing options that I know the Combined Authority are looking at. So Buffy, I think you're starting the presentation, aren't you? So if you could make sure that all 3 of you introduce yourselves before you start your presentations, that'd be really helpful.
Would it be possible for permission to share a screen, please?
Yeah, I don't know. Dan, is Dan here? Dawn, can we share a screen? Okay, yes. Can you give permission, Dawn?
We just have some accompanying slides which will help to illustrate our points. If not, I'm sure we can go ahead without them.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm sure you can. But what would be really helpful is that we can also circulate them as part of the minutes.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, while they're just going through to share the screen, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, so my name's Buffy. I am a third-year PhD student at the University of Cambridge. So my research sits within kind of stem cell biology, so not directly related to environmental policy, but I've also done some work with the East of England NHS Trust, looking at how hospitals and primary care can be helped on a transition towards net zero, and that's also kind of operating in this local environment. So that's kind of where my interest in this project really stems from.
Hello, I'm Andrew. I'm also a third-year PhD student based at the Department of Veterinary Medicine, and my research is focusing on prion diseases, which are a type of transmissible neurodegenerative diseases. And I've got a particular interest in science communication.
Hi, and I'm Robert Pierce Higgins. I'm a finishing chemistry PhD student, so hopefully finishing in the next couple of weeks. And I'm kind of interested in going into kind of environmental consulting and stuff like that after this. So this is a good springboard for that for me.
Fantastic. And it looks like we have got go on the presentation. Hurrah! So can everybody see that? That looks good for you guys. Fantastic.
We can.
Brilliant. So thank you so much for your kind introduction and also the opportunity to work on this project, which has been really great for us. So today I am going to be talking about our recommendation to establish a carbon advisory service. And then we're going to talk more about the Decarbonisation Fund. So Andrew's going to be talking about verification and validation of projects, and Rob is going to cover financing of the fund. So our initial project brief was to investigate the strategic business case for the establishment of a Cambridgeshire Decarbonisation Fund. So this is a fund which sells carbon credits to Cambridgeshire businesses. And really, as we began discussing this topic, we realised that establishing a decarbonisation fund might be jumping the gun a little bit. So how would businesses know how many carbon credits they ought to buy if they hadn't yet rigorously calculated their emissions? And simultaneously, how could we ensure that carbon credits were only used for to kind of offset hard to reduce emissions? And that alongside this, businesses made every effort to reduce their emissions alongside. And so this is where our proposal for a carbon advisory service comes in. So basically, carbon advisory services help businesses to calculate and reduce their emissions, providing support at various steps in the process. And our research has revealed that the carbon advisory space is very fragmented, it's very complicated to navigate, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises, and it really lacks a unified region-specific source of guidance. And so this is where our first recommendation comes in. The Cambridgeshire County Council establishes a local carbon advisory service to help SMEs in Cambridgeshire decarbonise, providing accessible and high quality support at all steps in the process. Now, a similar service is available to businesses in Suffolk and Norfolk, and this is provided by BEE Anglia and the Carbon Charter, which accredits businesses for the carbon reducing steps that they've taken and provides them with a locally recognised badge. And we feel this is a pretty good model upon which the Cambridgeshire Carbon Advisory Service could be based. So this is just a quick diagram to demonstrate how we envisage the Carbon Advisory Service linking with the Decarbonisation Fund. So SMEs, many of whom have done limited work calculating and reducing their carbon emissions, could be supported by the Carbon Advisory Service to do so. Large companies who are already obliged to audit and report their emissions through national schemes and compliance, basically, we would require that compliance with these national standards to be a prerequisite for engaging with the Carbon Advisory Service and the Decarbonisation Fund. And then both small and large businesses would be encouraged to offset any residual hard to reduce emissions by purchasing carbon credits through the fund. And then both could receive locally recognised accreditation for their efforts. And in terms of approaches for structuring this, we have two possible approaches that we suggest. So you could run this entirely in-house through council employees, and this would have the positive of giving you really good oversight of the advisory service, and excellent integration with the Decarbonisation Fund, but comes with the risk of more upfront demand, costs, more resource demand and upfront costs. Alternatively, you could work with partners who would offer kind of council approved service. So for example, Groundwork is the charity which does carbon auditing via BEE Anglia in Norfolk and Suffolk. And it is possible that the Carbon Charter could also be extended to Cambridgeshire as well. And there would be also possibilities for collaboration with the University of Cambridge. So a similar kind of scheme has been set up in Derbyshire County Council, collaborating with the University of Derby to offer resources to small and medium-sized enterprises. So with that, I'd just like to hand over to Andrew, who's going to be talking more about the Decarbonisation Fund.
Thanks, Buffy. Yep, I'm now going to be focusing on the Business Decarbonisation Fund. So next slide, please. Thanks. So the whole point of the Decarbonisation Fund is to help businesses transition to net zero by helping them to offset their hard to reduce emissions in the short to medium term. And so they can do this through purchasing carbon credits, which have been generated from local decarbonisation projects. And then the money generated from this can then be used to fund the maintenance of current projects, as well as help fund future projects within the portfolio. Next slide, please. So in particular, I'm going to be focusing on validation and verification, then Rob will be focusing on finance. So the importance with the Decarbonisation Fund is that businesses need to trust that the carbon credits that are being generated by the projects correspond to actual amounts of carbon that's being saved. And so this can be done through validation and verification projects, which is carried out by an independent third party. Validation at the start of the project, then verification at intervals throughout the project. And these involve checking various different aspects of the different projects, such as their predictions for carbon savings, as well as the measurements and monitoring of the carbon savings throughout. And so the details that are required to do these calculations will be specific to different project types. Next slide, please. So validation and verification can be done by registering individual projects with certification organisations. And these provide a framework for how to carry out the validation and verification, as well as reviewing relevant documentation. And so the examples on the right of the screen, and one of which is the Woodland Carbon Code, which specialises in forestry projects in the UK. So the advantage of registering projects with these organisations is that they're well recognised standards for the validation and verification for decarbonisation projects. However, the cost effectiveness can vary between organisations depending on their fee structure, as well as by the sizes of the projects. So in cases where it may not be cost effective for a project to go through these organisations, the alternative could be for the fund to use publicly available methodologies for how to carry out the validation and verification, and then to use third-party auditors and to then actually carry out the site visits and validation verification. Next slide, please. So therefore, recommendations for this section of the report would be to organise and perform validation and verification for the projects within the fund, and for each of these to determine whether to register these with certification organisations or to use an own standard for the fund for validation and verification. And where necessary, if relevant methodologies for the particular project type aren't available, these will need to be adapted from existing methodologies. And finally, we recommend using the Woodland Carbon Code for forestry projects. So now I'll be handing over to Rob for the financial considerations.
Thank you. So the final section of research that we've performed for this is on the financial aspect of the fund. In particular, how large should the fund be and the predicted financial and environmental benefits of it. For this, we have constructed a financial model of the fund over 40 years, and the full details of which can be found in our report. So the financial model that we've made is based on this flow diagram. So the ultimate aim of the fund is that new projects could be solely funded by revenue from previous projects. However, initial funding will be required for the first set of projects due to projects only producing credits once they're fully developed. This initial funding has been separated into two types on the left. So we've got project-specific income, which covers any loans or funds given for specific projects. So these will mainly be government grants or loans, and maybe investment from the UK Infrastructure Fund. whereas project-independent income is revenue which the fund could access which isn't linked to particular projects. For example, issuing of green bonds and potential carbon levies on property developers. Finally, council borrowing is proposed to supply some of the initial funding, but this will quickly be phased out once project revenue starts coming in. So we'll go to the next slide. So from the research that has been performed and the model that was proposed, we recommend three main things for the financial side of the fund. Firstly, initial funding will be required and should be attained from multiple sources in order to increase the potential size of the fund as well as the resilience. Secondly, the fund will return a profit as well as reducing emissions, and both of these scale well as the fund size increases. So making the fund as big as possible will just give more benefits to everyone. And finally, the projects that should be performed as part of this fund should only be those which are uneconomical without the selling of carbon credits. The fund should be set up to focus on the hardest to reduce emissions, and projects which would be economical without the selling of carbon credits should be performed in addition to the fund, either through the council or external partners, rather than as a part of it, in order to get the biggest impact. So yeah, finally, just to conclude, today we've informed you about the opportunity of a carbon advisory service to complement the proposed Decarbonisation Fund, as well as the importance of verification and validation of carbon credits and the potential financial benefits the fund would give. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Cheryl, and thank you to our researchers for a really clear and very interesting presentation. So I'm going to ask members whether you have any questions either for Cheryl or for the researchers. Could you please indicate? Councillor Bradnam and Councillor Goldsack, in turn.
Well, team, thank you so much. That was a really interesting report, so well presented as always from our CUSB researchers, so thank you. I'm just wondering about the verification and validation aspects, and you talked about the possibilities of using third parties. I'm just mindful that it's such a positive thing, but I'm mindful that there is room for people misidentifying their motivation, if you see what I mean, and how the validation and verification is going to be really crucial to make sure, as you said, that the projects that are being supported are those for which the emissions would be the most difficult to mitigate, but also that means that would be quite a lot of pressure to misrepresent the project. So I'm just wondering, that's a bit of a mean one because it's sort of all immediately looking at the problems, and I don't mean to do that because I think what you're proposing is a really good idea, but I'm just looking at the long term as to how we make sure that those funds are not misused. I just wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
Do you want me to start?
That would be a good idea.
Okay, so obviously what businesses want is a fair process so that when they buy a carbon credit, they know that that's being genuinely, is genuinely reducing carbon emissions. So there has to be some form of measurements and verification of carbon emission reductions, and that is a process that is complex. So I think definitely for businesses to be happy to invest, you need an accreditation process. I think the second thing which you're alluding to is if you're a business and you've got 100 tons of carbon emissions, can you then offset 110 tons of emissions just by paying into a fund? And that's not the intention here. And that's really not the intention of what the researchers have been proposing. They are proposing that it's only for those hard to treat emissions. So for example, you're a meat producer currently selling meat to supermarkets where you might need 20 years to change your product line. And so if you've got emissions in your business, like you can buy renewable energy or make your building more efficient, you have to do that. We won't be looking to offset through those processes. So I hope that helps in terms of assuring that what you're looking to do is only really treat additionality and hard to treat. Researchers, did you want to add anything to that? Oh, okay.
No, okay, thank you. Councillor Goldsack was next.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you for the report, researchers. Excellent as always. The question I have is more about the way forward. We appear to have our neighbours in Norfolk and Suffolk have a very good solution already in BEE or B, or I like the little symbol. I thought that worked well. Have we given consideration to maybe a different option of working with those and maybe outsourcing that capability as opposed to raising the funds and doing it all ourselves? If they've already got the capability there and they've already got the thought pattern there as well, which is, you know, quite a step for us. I mean, it's not impossible and I think we can do it, but I'm just wondering if that's been a calculated and financially calculated alternative route.
So did you want to just share your learning on the carbon advisory services from the Suffolk, and then I can add onto that? Yeah.
Yeah, so just to kind of come towards your question. So what is offered in Norfolk and Suffolk at the moment is purely the carbon advisory side. So Norfolk and Suffolk do not offer any kind of decarbonisation fund whereby local businesses can apply credits. So anything that we were to learn from BEE Anglia or the Carbon Charter, which I think there's a lot to learn, and I think that kind of option 2, which I presented in terms of how Cambridgeshire could go about setting up a carbon advisory service, very much could be partnering with BEE and the Carbon Charter. But it would be purely that arm, it would be purely the carbon advisory service. I don't think we could learn much from them in terms of the Decarbonisation Fund. But something which we do touch on in the report is the idea that maybe Norfolk and Suffolk could buy into the Decarbonisation Fund as well. Maybe that would be something that we could reciprocally offer them, would be access to this fund, which would, yeah, possibly increase the amount of money coming in. But yeah, I think that there's a wealth of knowledge there about how to support local businesses in decarbonising, which I think would be really valuable to tap into.
Thank you, Buffy. And Cheryl, you were going to add to that, I think.
Yes, I was just going to say quite key here is linking in with the business board. So the local enterprise partnership, which already does quite a lot of work on business advisory services. So it's trying to see where and how we could have that discussion with Suffolk and Norfolk, with the business board, to see where they would like to take something like this.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Milnes.
Thank you, Chair. Excuse me a second. Yeah, I've got two questions really. The first refers to, with our labyrinthine structure of local government, how do we avoid duplication of effort between the combined authority and our districts particularly? So trying to make sure that we align all of those involved in that, both in funding and in actions. For example, I heard a reference to potential funding from property developers. Well, presumably that would have to come into the process of applications for developments, which obviously is a district council responsibility. And then the second question really is over the relationship or the voluntary nature of small and medium enterprise companies taking on carbon reduction exercises, and where I'm unfamiliar with any legislation over that, because particularly for micro businesses, for those of 5 and less, of which there are hundreds and even thousands in our county, who will find the administration of such things really quite an onerous burden. And I wonder how we're looking to deal with that issue. Thank you.
Okay, there's a few things in there. So I'm going to start with the voluntary side, and then I'll bring the researchers in. So this is the issue of micro businesses or SMEs, and why would they be wanting to participate particularly? So we already have businesses in Cambridgeshire, which are small businesses, who are being asked to demonstrate their low carbon credentials for working with other larger businesses because they're part of their scope 3 emissions. So there was a particular company which came through to us via, which was working with Newmarket Races and a hospitality company. And they have been asked how they will be reducing their carbon emissions. So I think micro and SME businesses are going to be subjected to push and pull from other organisations. And so we really do need to support them in that endeavour. I think that's the first thing. Your second point, which is around let's say local planning authorities, and how local planning authorities would need to be engaged, because we've shared this report with our other partners, and so we've had comments through from the district councils, and the policy position is that you want developers to deliver as much on site as possible. If they can't deliver carbon reductions on site, is there an option for them to then come and use the fund to offset the residual emissions that they can't do on site? And so that's a narrative and a discussion that is ongoing. You also mentioned the issue of having, let's say, a complex structure across Cambridgeshire in terms of governance. This would, to make a decarbonisation fund work, it needs to be done at the largest level that we can. It needs to be across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. And as alluded to in your answer, Buffy, it was about also, would we want to link with Norfolk and Suffolk? Because this, to try and develop the number of projects to bring forward the number of carbon credits, it's better done at a larger scale. So we have shared this also with the Combined Authority, and the intention is to have conversations to include this in an action plan that's coming forward for the Climate Working Group, which is at a Combined Authority level, which is trying to address the Independent Commission's recommendations, so that this type of fund would be one of the financing options that can be considered as part of that. Would you like to add anything to that?
Just very briefly, I would add that so Milton Keynes Council, and also there's various borough councils in London which have a kind of link between property development and sort of paying into sort of some kind of like offsetting structure, not exactly the same as what we're proposing, but it has been done elsewhere. And I think the only other thing with the micro businesses, and kind of as well as them being pushed because they're part of other organisations' scope 3s, I'd also say there's a lot of immediate benefit to them in terms of cost offsetting by adopting low carbon practices. So there's a couple of bits of research that we quote in the report where the cost savings are quite significant and redeemed sort of in a sort of 1 to 2 year time period. So yeah, and we'd hope that a carbon advisory service could help remove any of those kind of administrative barriers that micro businesses would be facing in implementing carbon saving measures.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Gay.
Yeah, so I'm just going to quote Karl Marx, who said philosophers have interpreted the world, or indeed PhD students, in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. At the moment, the funding of the county council is under a huge amount of pressure, and my question is, firstly, what realistic possibility is there of using public works loan board money to set these structures up, and whether there have been any initial discussions with the finance team, and particularly Tom Kelly, about the possibility of this. The thing that I'm really concerned about is that this kind of activity, when push comes to shove with the budget setting, will be seen as a nice to have, and will be prioritised for trimming back and cutting. So my question is, are we progressing this by talking about setting up finance structures which can put it into effect.
Okay, we're not yet at the point of it's not yet at the stage that there is specific detailed work on the financing arrangements that have been undertaken. We have shared this with finance colleagues, and indeed, I think Matthew Rathbone and his colleagues Ellie Todd and Stephen Howarth, and I know Tom's also seen the report, have made comments into the funding model. Did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, just to kind of say that the majority, so yeah, the idea would be that most of it wouldn't require a significant amount of council borrowing compared to like borrowing from the government and other ways. And yeah, I think from talks with Ellie Todd and Matthew Rathbone, they seem to suggest that if it's kind of a case of almost like investing in future things, they think that they'd be able to have things justified through the Public Works Loan Board, but that would need a lot more discussion and detailed discussion with finance to get that confirmed, I think was the idea that I got from it.
So, and the other thing is that it's not just Cambridgeshire County Council. This is bigger than us as an organisation. So it needs to be discussed with our partners, businesses, government, to see what are the funding streams that are already available through decarbonisation that we can use to fund projects, as an example. So if you just look at Swaffham Prior, okay, that has used borrowing, it's got government support, but it's now at a point of being able to sell carbon credits. So the really critical thing is how you get projects developed to be able to then provide the carbon credits and then be able to generate that revenue over time to invest in new projects. So, but coming back to your point about PWLB and the socialising of the idea, it's been shared with colleagues, but there's a lot more work to do.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions at the moment for Cheryl and the researchers. Many thanks for your answers to that. I think that was very interesting. So I'm going to move on to the debate now, and the recommendations are to note the Cuspy Research Report on a Cambridgeshire Decarbonisation Fund and to agree the next steps as set out in paragraph 2.8 of the report. So I'm going to propose that and ask the Vice Chair to second. Thank you. So does anybody wish to speak on those recommendations? Not seeing anybody, which I think is testament to the quality of the report we have in front of us. So in summing up, I just want to run very quickly through the next steps because they're really important. And this started out as about funding, and it has ended up with its first recommendation for next steps being around the creation of an advisory service. And that's very significant. It is very, very clear to us as an authority that what not only businesses but also our community partners and other organisations are crying out for is information, reliable, trustworthy information from trustworthy sources and knowledge about how to do the things that people are increasingly interested in doing to contribute to tackling climate change and to decarbonising. So that's a really welcome development as this piece of work has gone on, and it's something that I wholeheartedly endorse. There is much to be done, as has been said, to progress that idea and to work out on what basis and with whom that needs to be done, but it's certainly something that we need to do and will provide a really solid base for future work. I'm summing up, Councillor Bradnam, I'm afraid. The second next step is to progress the Swaffham Prior Community Heat Project, which is this council's flagship project, through this process, which will give us an understanding of what that process feels like and the costs and other implications of going through that process, but will also provide us with a project that is making carbon credits available for selling on, and the first contribution to the scheme. And finally, the final step is, again, working with the combined authority and our our local authority partners on how this fund can fit in within the combined authorities' climate financing recommendations. They've received the report of the Independent Climate Commission, and how they can include that Decarbonisation Fund in their action plan, which is currently under development and which may help address some of the financial issues as well that have been alluded to in the question. So there's some very positive next steps in front of us, and I'm really looking forward to seeing those enacted, which I hope with your support they will be. So I would like to see those in favour, please, of supporting the recommendations. Thank you. And again, I think that is unanimous. So thank you, researchers, very much indeed for your contribution to this piece of work. Councillor Bradnam, do you have a point of order?
No, I just wanted to say, and I'm sorry I didn't put my hand up before, I just wanted to say thank you very much to the report writers for completing so fully the items 3 and 4, the alignment with corporate priorities and significant implications on our report template, because that is very much appreciated. And obviously for this project, it's really important. So
thank you very much indeed. Right, I'm going to now move us on to the next item, which is another CUSPI report, which is on local area energy planning. So once again, we have a different group of researchers this time. And once again, I'll ask Cheryl to introduce this report and to introduce the CUSPI researchers so that they can present their findings on this. So thank you, Cheryl.
So yes, I'm really pleased to be able to present the research report here at committee, which is focusing on an aspect of local area energy planning, and particularly heat zoning and heat networks, specifically targeted at market towns, and not looking at the rural area, because we've got Swaffham Prior addressing some of that on how you address rural communities. And government is already looking at the larger urban areas like Manchester and Newcastle, where you've got high density homes and living, where heat networks are more easily and commercially deliverable. So government's been working with local authorities over the last year trying to develop its heat zoning policy. So this is effectively when you identify an area which could bring forward a heat network as the decarbonised solution for heating and hot water, and that's seen as the lowest cost for that community. So what we collaborated on with the researchers here was to say, we've not done this before. So what does it look like when you apply the methodologies, which are the local area energy planning methodology from the Energy Systems Catapult, and the methodologies that BEIS are bringing forward? And so what you'll see in front of you is a very detailed piece of evidence gathering. And it's been incredibly impressive that you've done this in the 3 to 4 months that you've had on the project. And again, I just want to emphasize to members that these are not paid consultants. The researchers are not necessarily specialists in heat zoning, but what they've managed to pull together from data available and apply and adapt a methodology to give us some form of sense of what it takes has really helped us build our skills and knowledge in the local authority. So I'm excited to have you present your research report. And then afterwards, let's talk about the how we want to progress this work as part of our bigger decarbonisation strategy for heat for our communities. So if you could introduce yourself, presenters, and your background, and then I think you can share your screen.
Thank you, Cheryl. So I think Hannah will be sharing the screen, and then we'll just introduce ourselves briefly before we start. So I'm Grace. I'm a third-year PhD student in the History and Philosophy of Science department. So my PhD research isn't directly related to environmental policy, but I'm broadly interested in how evidence gets converted into policy. And I've also been on the committee of CUSPI for the past 2 years.
Hello, my name's Hannah. I'm a final year PhD student in the Earth Science department, and I'm looking at fluid flow in the mantle. So this has been a very different from my normal day-to-day work. So it's been very interesting to think about local area energy planning. Thank you for that opportunity.
Hi, I'm Lizzie. I am a third year PhD student also in earth sciences. I study earthquakes and mountain building, but I'm also really interested in climate policy, and it's been really interesting to look at decarbonisation on a local scale. So yeah, thank you again for the opportunity to get involved in a project like this. And yeah, I'll hand over to those.
So thank you, Cheryl, for the introduction. As Cheryl already summarized, we've been looking at establishing an evidence base for heat networks in Cambridgeshire and specifically in Huntington, Ely and March. Next slide, please, Hannah. Okay, so in the presentation today, we'll start off by explaining why we need to decarbonize heat, why that needs to be a priority. Then we'll quickly summarize what a heat network is. We'll explain the landscape of heat networks across the UK, how they're already being implemented in different areas. And then we'll move on to looking at the methodology that we've used to look at Cambridgeshire specifically. So we'll explain the steps we've taken to choose priority locations for initial heat networks in Cambridgeshire. And then we will draw out the priority areas that we've identified in Huntington, Ely and March. And we'll finish with some conclusions and next steps. First, why do we need to decarbonize heat? CCC and PCC have committed to reaching net zero by 2050. And 21% of carbon emissions in those areas are emitted by the domestic sector. So the domestic sector is a huge emitter. And within that, 80% of domestic energy demand comes from energy for space and water heating, which is currently mostly supplied by the gas network, so by a very carbon intensive source. At the same time, we have proven technologies, including heat pumps and heat networks, which can effectively reduce those carbon emissions from heating. And if we take those actions, we're buying ourselves time to give us a buffer to adopt technologies and develop technologies in some harder to decarbonize sectors like agriculture. So those are the main reasons why we need to focus on decarbonizing heat.
So heat networks are one of the most cost-effective ways of reducing carbon emissions for heating. When energy is generated in an energy center and then distributed through insulated pipes to multiple domestic and non-domestic buildings. By establishing a heat network, we can exploit the largest scale lower cost of renewables, which increases efficiency and increases carbon savings too, especially as the networks increase in size. Often the heat source is a ground or air source heat pump, but it also could be a hydrogen boiler or waste energy from industry. It's predicted that 18% of the UK heat will have to come from heat networks by 2050 in order to meet net zero targets in a cost-effective manner. There are a few examples already from across the UK of heat networks. Most of these have a ground source or air source heat pump as the main heat source, for example, in Swaffham Prior. Or waste heat, for example, in Leeds, they're using their recycling plants, waste heat, to be the main heat source. Or in Islington in London, they're using a Northern Line ventilation shaft as their waste heat. Most also include backup alternative energy in order to meet peak heat demand, for example, gas boilers, and also thermal energy stores to regulate demand. The energy centre is often built on government-owned land, And it begins by connecting a small portion of buildings and then expands. For example, in Gateshead, they initially connected the Baltic Arts Centre and other public buildings before extending the heat network to council-owned flats nearby. So most homes are able to connect without upgrading their central heating systems, and the idea is to provide space heating at around 23 degrees for all homes connected. In our report, we give evidence for heat network prioritisation in Huntingdon, Ely and March, but it's really important to note that eventually all homes and businesses will need to be supplied with decarbonised heat, and alongside that, good insulation to ensure the most energy efficient solution. To choose the location of the heat network, often it's easiest to do it in urban areas or densely populated areas because that minimises the length of insulated piping and therefore heat loss from the piping. In areas of high heat demand, because they have the greatest need to decarbonise, and anchor loads, for example, hospitals and swimming pools, which have a constant energy demand through time, heat demand doesn't fluctuate, so the overall heat network has a more constant demand. It's good to have a mixture of residential and commercial demand because that again reduces the variation in heat demand throughout the day and reduces pressure on the network. Public and council-owned buildings are often good as an initial centre for the heat network because they are easier to enforce connection to the network, and also you minimise the risk in developing the initial heat network.
Cool. So considering all the points that Hannah just talked about on the previous slide and adapting some Bayes methodology, we have used Bayes domestic gas consumption data to generate maps of gas demand in our 3 priority towns. And we use these maps of gas demand effectively as a proxy for heat demand because we note that almost all buildings and properties in Huntingdon, Ely and March are heated by gas. So the maps are coloured so that the red areas on these maps are showing postcodes with greater than average gas demand for domestic properties in the east of England, and blue postcodes are showing areas with lower than average gas consumption. So in Huntingdon, we have identified 3 areas that we think would be most suitable for the installation of a heat network, and these are shown by the yellow outlines numbered 1, 2 and 3. So in zone 1, which Hannah is indicating, we can see that the postcodes for which we do have data for all have higher than average heat demand. And within this zone, we have a really great mix of building types. So there's residential properties, there are schools, a police station, and also a large hospital, which would act as an anchor load, ensuring sort of high heat demand for the network. We note that there aren't any existing heat sources in this region. For example, a place that's producing lots of waste heat, so there would need to be an energy centre constructed for this zone. And then zone 2, which is sort of nearer the centre of town, this is mostly residential properties, but also schools and a supermarket. And then zone 3, out on the east side of the town, mostly residential properties, but there is council-owned land available close to some of the major roads, which could be used as a location for an energy centre. Next slide, please. In Ely, we've only identified one zone which we think would be most suitable for a heat network, which is near the centre of town. We can see that pretty much all the postcodes have sort of high gas and therefore probably heat demand. It's a good mixture of residential and commercial properties. There are lots of schools within this zone as well. And it might be possible to use some of the land on the school sites as a site for the energy centre. Next slide, please. And then in March, we have 2 possible zones which we think would be the best choices. So zone 1 has a great mixture of building types, including large public buildings and anchor loads such as the football stadium, the fire station, and a few schools. And within this zone is also the Fenland District Council building. And we think that the council-owned land for an energy centre could be up near the March train station. And then zone 2 down in the south of March is close to a really large area of council-owned land, again, possibly suitable for an energy centre. And there are residential buildings, care homes and schools within this zone, but we think that zone 1 would still be the most suitable if we're prioritising places for heat zones because of the larger public buildings within this area.
So to summarise the conclusions that we've established in this report, We found that heating is one of the biggest sources of carbon emissions in Cambridgeshire. We found that heat networks powered by low carbon heat sources could help reduce heating emissions in Cambridgeshire by up to 99% by 2050. We've also found that there are areas in all three of the regions we were looking at, Huntingdon, Ely and March, that could be prioritised for the development of initial heat networks, and we've mapped those areas out. And finally, we want to emphasise that eventually all buildings will need to be powered by low carbon heat sources. So this, what we're proposing, is just the first step in a much bigger picture. And then next slide. So next steps that would need to be undertaken to really further the conclusions that we've established here would be to run stakeholder engagement. So to identify the groups that would be impacted by the construction of heat networks and run discussions with them to make sure that everyone's concerns and interests are taken into account. Second would be to include heating decarbonisation as a priority in local plans. And finally, before any of our recommendations could be implemented, a full technical analysis of our proposed networks would have to be taken into account. So those are the main forward-looking priorities that we've identified. Thank you again for giving us the chance to do this research and present it to you, and we'd be really happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much indeed. So do members have any questions for Cheryl and our researchers? Councillor Ferguson.
Thank you, Chair. It's less of a question and a comment. I hope that's okay. I think it was an excellent presentation and something that we're desperately in need of. I think it's almost criminal that there's so few practical examples of this sort of heat network that are currently available, and I'm very proud that the County Council is working one at Swatham prior. I'd urge some caution in basing the location for these heat networks on the areas of greatest demand, because greatest demand could also be the areas of greatest waste and those houses with the worst insulation and perhaps the people who can afford to spend the most energy. We're in the midst of an energy crisis, which I think is going to really hit hard later this winter. And I think perhaps I can understand that you're going to get most bang for your buck in terms of carbon reductions by looking at those properties which use the most energy. But there's also another axis, is the people who need cheaper, more reliable energy more. So we could also base that on the areas of greatest need. Another element to that is, of course, the properties with greatest demand could also be the worst insulated properties, and this technology probably won't work in badly insulated properties. So in the end, I think we have to, everybody has to be on a network like this or have their own heat pump in their property. But I'm just a bit nervous about giving cheap, low carbon energy to the people who can afford it most, if you get what I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ferguson. You've anticipated my question perfectly. How much is that map actually mapping proxies for poorly insulated properties rather than areas where there is greater need?
I think I'll just quickly add to that, and then researchers, if you want to also add. You're right. The wider indices of multiple deprivation would be something that local authorities would also want to apply in the next steps, or any methodology that you're going to be wanting to progress. So this was purely based on a narrow focus on gas and energy bills, whereas we would want to make different choices potentially about fuel poverty and prevention in terms of health needs, or trying to ensure that some of our, let's say, key buildings, which we needed to have functioning if there were any future energy crises or critical events, that you'd want those functioning. So you're absolutely right, we need more application of different data sets. Did you want to add anything on that, researchers?
Yes.
Yeah, I can just jump in on that. Yeah, that's a really great question. Insulation is something that's come up in talks before, and it is something that we've considered, and that's why we've said that you would need to conduct some kind of full technical and cost benefit analysis in these proposed zones to see whether actually installing the network is better than just sort of retrofitting properties and improving insulation. But it's important to note that even once you improve the insulation of a property, buildings are still going to need low carbon heat sources in order to reach your net zero goals by 2050. And by constructing a heat network that takes advantage of low carbon heat sources such as geothermal energy, or using one of these sort of larger ground source or air source heat pumps, it allows more properties to take advantage of these low carbon heat sources, because it's not practical to install a ground source heat pump in every single individual property, for example.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Councillor Goldsack was next.
Thank you. I've got 4 points. In fact, I'm going to start with one, which is I'd like to record my thanks to Ian Manning. Every time I see things come out of Cuspy, it blows me away. So well done, researchers. I think this is excellent, but also well done, Ian, for bringing this to the council a few years ago. Point one really picks up on Councillor Ferguson's point. I really enjoyed the analysis of the 3 towns, but I think we would be foolhardy to start with those 3 towns, having not looked at the other ones, because there may be low-hanging fruit in other areas of better insulated, more affordable needs. So I think that's something to do. But I think as a start, that's really, really good. So I'd like your opinion on whether we should look at other towns before starting out on this. The second point was, forgive me, I can't remember which of the presenters said this. Did you say 18% or 80% by 2050? Would you said all the heat work should come from, and I couldn't quite hear at the time whether you said 18 or 80% should come from heat networks by 2050. That was the second point. The third point, as a chairman of a local football team in the town of Soham, I'd be amazed if a football club could be identified as an anchorage against the criteria of, say, a swimming pool or a hospital, but that's just something. And lastly, just a last compliment. I think this report has thrown up the best phrase that I've heard for a long while in local government, which was the phrase, which was a low regret solution, because I thought that applied to me on a Friday night if I had one more on my way home. But I genuinely thought that was a fantastic solution. Be identified, be useful if you could identify a few low regret solutions other than that last point I have.
Thank you. A reminder that we are still on questions, but Cheryl and researchers, do you want to tackle the questions within that, please?
I think the researchers can clarify, I think it was 18%, not 80%, wasn't it?
Yeah, 18, not 80.
Did she say 18%?
18.
Yes,
not
18.
80.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The second point, which was about low regret solutions, I agree. What we're all trying to do is find the solutions that will work and won't be in 10 years' time something that we think, well, would we have done that differently? I can't say that everything in terms of decarbonisation moving forward is going to work out that way, but let's hope we can get as many low regret solutions as possible. And then I think the main point, which is this issue of saying, you know, we just highlighted 3 market towns. We've looked at how you do this, getting the evidence base. And I think certainly the researchers have got some skill sets that we probably need to learn from ourselves at county. But having watched and observed them go through this, we also understand what type of information is required. And so we will need to look more widely at all of the market towns, and we have a lot of them, to say, well, if we were wanting to invest in 1 or 2, where would it be? And it wouldn't just be saying Huntingdon, Ely and March, just because we've done this first set of work. It needs to be where we could get the biggest bang for our buck and the biggest benefit for communities. So hopefully that reassures you.
Yeah, it does reassure me, but I think what I find really interesting, everybody's got local knowledge. But if I look at, say, some villages around us, and I know we're talking about towns, you've got somewhere like Isleham and Fordham, and they're actually small villages, growing villages, but over quite a large geography. But then you've got somewhere like Burwell, which is a large village, small town, and actually that's got quite a lot of density close to each other in terms of its. That's just off the top of my head. So thank you. I think looking at that is going to be absolutely key before we decide the best bang for our buck way forward.
Okay, thank you. Was there anything? Oh, I think that tackled the questions, didn't it? Councillor Milnes was next.
Thank you, Chair. So I've got a couple of comments. So thanks for the graphics in the slides. That was very helpful to understand. And then there's a couple of questions I'll go over. For example, we've got, I think, a district heat system in existence at Edicton, where they use geothermals for their heat source, and so I'd be pleased to see reference to that as a local example. And then further afield, we've got the geothermal project at the Edicton project in Cornwall, which is looking to establish how very deep boreholes can produce a really very hot liquid to generate energy, to generate electricity. So I'd be pleased to see that sort of scheme put into the consideration as well. Because as my colleague Stephen mentioned, what we will be looking for is resilience in this global energy crisis that we're going to encounter this year. And these systems will certainly provide some resilience against those situations. And what we really need to be concerned with is many people going into energy and heat poverty. So if these schemes can be brought forward as quickly as possible, I'd be delighted. Thank you.
Thank you. Was there a question you wanted to answer in that, Sharon?
The only thing that I thought might be helpful to clarify is you were talking about the Edicton project and deep geothermal. And I think across the country, there are quite different opportunities for accessing deep geothermal. It would be interesting to know, and perhaps we need to do a bit of work on what that looks like for Cambridgeshire, because I suspect it's not to the same level as Cornwall. I don't know, researchers, if you've got any input there. No? Okay.
I do, I think, yeah, the Cambridgeshire deep geothermal will not be as good as Cornwall. Cornwall has the radioactive granites, which supply the heat for the Edicton project. Deep geothermal.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks very much indeed. And a reminder that we are still on questions. Councillor Bradnam.
Question was for debate. Sorry, my observation was for debate.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Corney, you indicated, was yours a question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Obviously, we've looked at existing properties and areas, as you picked out at the moment. You have to forgive me if I have missed this, but has anything been looked into some of the bigger developments? Is there an optimum size to sort of look into this? I mean, we often see a larger development of 200 plus houses, so the market town sort of thing. Is that something that's been considered?
So you're talking about new developments or extensions to towns. So certainly from my colleagues in the district councils working on local plan policy, where there is opportunity to identify potential heat networks, I think they are working on those policy positions, because actually if you do have an extension, a new part to a town, that can be the starting point for a heat network. And obviously it's managed, it's much easier when you put something in from brand new because you're not retrofitting. So it hasn't been covered in this, I don't think, researchers, has it? This has been more focused on retrofit. But if you want additional information about policies for new, then I'm sure we can find stuff for you.
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing, oh, Councillor King.
Thank you, Chair. My question is more based on the technology, probably just based on my lack of knowledge on how it works. But in terms of developing these networks, how easy is it for properties to then connect to them? Do homeowners need to do a lot of modifications to their properties? Is that expensive? Because obviously the last thing we want to do is create these networks that nobody can then connect to. Thank you.
Want to answer that? Did you hear that?
Yeah, I can have a look at it. It's not something that we've addressed sort of specifically in the report. I think it's a kind of thing where if properties are already connected to a gas network, it would be a lot easier to connect them to a heat network as opposed to sort of an isolated property which is being powered by oil or something like that. But yeah, I think in terms of the sort of the homes themselves, it's more about connecting it to the network, but the actual sort of central heating sort of technology within the home itself would not need to be modified in these situations.
Just to add on to that, oh, sorry, Cheryl. I was just going to add that the one of the key considerations is whether the home is already fit with radiators and a water-based central heating system. And if it is, then it can be very easily connected onto a heat network because you've already got that infrastructure. But if the home is, for example, being heated purely electrically, then that would require a lot of retrofits and upgrades within the home. And then one other thing to consider is that there's broadly two different types of heat network technologies. One is low temperature and one is high temperature. So for a low temperature heat network, the water that's circulating in the pipes is at a much lower temperature than what you'd actually need in your radiators to heat your home to an acceptable level. And in that case, you need some additional say individual heat pump attached to every home to upgrade from the temperature that's being distributed in the pipes to the temperature you need in the home. For a high temperature heat network, though, that might not even be needed. So then the connection would be even easier, at least for systems that for houses that already have radiator systems.
Our experience in Swaffham Prior is covering all of those scenarios that have just been described. So we have some homes which have been electrically heated. And so to change those to wet systems, we're having to get grants to help convert an electric only system to a wet system to be able to connect. And the reason we would do that is because it's 3 times more expensive to just be electrically heated than it would be to be connecting to the network. For the homes which are heated by oil, they have existing radiators, and because we're delivering a high temperature solution, it's a matter of just joining into their existing radiators. Now, we haven't yet gone through that total process of commissioning, but there isn't an expectation that you'd need to do significant works in your home. And I think the only other thing which was just mentioned there, which was this difference between high temperature and low temperature systems. So if you were going for a low temperature system, you would want your homes to be efficient, because otherwise you're going to be running that system for a long time, and that wouldn't work on electricity bills. So I would be suggesting that definitely new home developments could be running on low temperature systems, because you'll be coming forward with very high building standards in terms of energy, I would, over the next few years. So I think together we've answered you.
Thank you very much, everybody. I've not seen any more questions, so I'm going to thank our researchers very much, Hannah, Lizzie and Grace, for your answering our questions so ably. And I'm going to then now open this for debate. The recommendations are to note the research report and to agree the next steps that are set out in paragraph 2.7 of the report. Again, I'm going to propose that and ask my Vice Chair to second. Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Gay. I gather that there was at least one contribution, Councillor Bradnam.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, again, another excellent report. And of course, in the discussion or in the clarifications, we've raised some very interesting issues. So one of the things that I has been raised is the fact that there are other examples locally, some not working yet. But for example, I know that South Cambs District Council, as driven by its Climate Change Committee, in combination with the City Council through the Greater Cambridge Planning Service, is very mindful of its climate change responsibilities, and is certainly South Cambs is in the process of installing ground source heat pumps in the car park at Cambourne at present. So when it's possible to use local examples and when they're up and running, that would be great. And as Councillor Milnes points out, we've got the example at Edicton already. So it would be really good to look at those and see how outcomes are coming out of that. But the other point, I'm really interested to hear this, as Cheryl has explained, the relative ease of converting an oil-fired system, or shall we say a wet-based system, to a heat network-based system, and the difficulty of converting something that's running electrically to a heat network. And I'm just thinking we need to be thinking strategically about this, because often planning decisions made by district council planning authorities are thinking in terms of conversion. When we're giving approvals for new developments, we're thinking about the fact that new gas systems will stop, and so we may be inadvertently encouraging people to shift to an electric-based system through our planning conditions, for example, when in fact actually it might be easier long term if people stayed on a wet-based, currently gas-fired system, so that then in future it can be still wet-based but heat network fueled system. And I'm just thinking that's quite a complicated concept to describe, and we need to be alerting our planning authorities, the members making decisions and making conditions, that we need to be advising them as to how best to make those planning decisions, which is probably a piece of work for authority to authority, but it's something we need to be careful about, isn't it? Sorry, I'm talking to Cheryl, but if anybody, if the researchers have any thoughts on that, that'd be interesting.
There's certainly a lot of work still to be done on this, I agree, and it's certainly very complex. Councillor Corney, you are the next speaker, and then Councillor Ferguson.
Thank you. Just really to come back on what my colleagues just said, but just as somebody that's built a few houses now, even an electric-based heating system is still, still a wet system. So it might be an air source heat pump, but these work better with underfloor heating. Just a point of information for those that didn't know. It's but that is an underfloor heating system that works at a lower temperature. Now we talk about lower temperature systems. They don't necessarily work with radiators. That's a bit kind of a misconception. I think it's because it's all about the convection of the heat. Obviously, to convect from radiators, you need a higher temperature in the first place, whereas an underfloor system, it can run at a lower temperature because it's more of an ambient temperature. It's just not so much of a debate, but just a point of clarity, maybe.
Thank you very much. Councillor Ferguson.
Thank you, Chair. I think, like most people, I'm hugely in favour of this, and I think we owe it to the climate to accelerate this as much as possible. We talked a lot in the paper about retrofitting old properties, but where I live in St Neots, outside my bedroom window, they're building 3,500 new properties, each of which will have a gas boiler fitted. And that makes no sense, because eventually those boilers are going to have to be ripped out. And it would seem to me that those would be perfect opportunities at low cost in well-insulated properties to try out this technology. So what we have to get this into local plans as a condition for building large developments of new housing, but also there has to be a change in government policy to force housing developers to invest this technology, because until that happens, they won't do it. It's somehow seen as being new technology when in fact it's well-established technology in other places in the world, and we just need to adopt it as quickly as possible. So it's great work, and I will be voting in favour, obviously.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ferguson. Councillor Goldsack and then Councillor King.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a point on the non-town local area networks. Obviously, we've got Swaffham, which is a fantastic example and a great project. I really do worry about scalability of it in future and where else we can put it. You know, if we look at the cost, there's a magic word which we keep mentioning here called grants. They're not going to be around forever and a day, and we've got to get to a position of sustainability, affordability. Some of the debate that's going on here is really excellent, pointing out the costs. Absolutely, a lower cost solution is underfloor heating, but retrofitting underfloor for above floor is an awful lot more work. So it's a difficult thing. So I just think that's something we've got to be very mindful of going forward. That Swaffham for me has always been a learning project, and we take those learnings and we learn from them, right? The real key message for coming out of Swaffham is how we've learned, what we've learned, and how we get scalability to all of the Swaffhams in our county, and there's hundreds of them.
Thank you very much. Councillor King.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to congratulate and thank the researchers on an excellent piece of work. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And as the member of Huntingdon North and Hertford, I read it with great interest. But just to reiterate a point that was made previously, I think looking at some of these, based on my local knowledge, looking at some of the postcodes, there's definitely some, let's say, more affluent postcodes that have got a lot of consumption versus some less affluent postcodes that have got low consumption, probably based more on what they can afford rather than what they actually need to use. So definitely a consideration going forward, I think. But yeah, thank you for a great piece of work.
Thank you. Councillor Gowing.
Thank you. Excellent work, and I support this entirely, but I'm wondering in March, which is my division, the areas that have been chosen seem to be because there's pieces of land where the buildings can be built, you know, to work this. But the houses, particularly in Area 1, are old and not really energy efficient. There's land between Area 1 and 2, which is been now passed, and I think there's going to be excess of, you know, thousands of houses, and I think it would be an idea, or certainly if you say once you fit gas boilers, if you're going to have a heat system, they're going to be ripped out, to consider whether we need to have a plant near those areas. I'm a bit disappointed in Area 1 because it only just missed my bungalow, which the only thing I now need is a heat source pump. But I think, you know, those areas may have been chosen for the wrong reason.
Thank you, Councillor Gowing. I'm not seeing any more speakers. I would like just to point out that at this stage, I think the three, yeah, I'll just comment on what Councillor Gowing said, that to point out that at this stage, I think those three areas are case studies rather than proposals. So I wouldn't be too worried about the detail at this stage. Councillor Ray, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to link this to the previous item from Cuspy. As I understand it, once a scheme like Swaffham Prior, which is grant funded, is up and running, it's possible to sell off carbon credits for that verifiable carbon saving and then reinvest the money in another scheme. And in that way, you can actually, the faster you do this, the faster you can recycle the money and sell off the if you like, the carbon credits for each individual scheme. Is that the correct understanding of how it works?
I'll allow Cheryl to come back, although we'd be on questions, but yes, I take the point that that's useful.
Okay, so there will be a range of projects that will be supported. So one of the things about heating projects which cut out or avoid carbon emissions for the future, they tend to be more expensive than if you're putting in, let's say, tree planting. So one of the things on the Decarbonisation Fund is that you're doing a blended cost over a range of different projects. So with the other thing that was put forward in the Decarbonisation Fund was that you wouldn't be investing in projects which didn't actually need carbon credits themselves to make them function. So the idea is that you would need to have some heating schemes and quite a few tree planting schemes to be able to then generate sufficient revenue to then recycle into new schemes. But your premise, which is about recycling from the investment into a range of schemes into new schemes, is right. And that it would speed up, the faster we do things, it'll speed up delivery.
Thank you. I've got two more speakers, Councillor Milnes and then Councillor Gay.
Thank you. I just wanted to endorse other people's support of this report, and thank you for presenting that to the researchers. We didn't mention in the debate today the value of mechanical ventilation and heat recovery systems, which can be used independently of the source of heat. So we've seen developments in my division where, although we haven't got passive house standards, which you would normally associate with these, we've got MVHR systems in place, which produce savings in the total energy consumption. And if we could make sure they're added into the mix, that would be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Gay.
Just as a point of information, the Edicton heat network was originally a gas powered heat network, and it is subsequently intended to replace it with air source heat pumps and not ground source heat pumps. A better example would be the Cavendish 3 project, which is completely using ground source heat pumps for a network across the whole of the West Cambridge site. I don't think the air source heat pump project is complete at the moment, so it's still being powered with gas.
Thank you. And finally, Councillor Coots.
I simply wanted to echo the comments formerly made. We're very fortunate actually to have representation from Huntingdon, March and Ely here, and the analysis of my patch in Ely that's shown there is exactly the same as other colleagues. It is a more affluent area, and therefore that's why it's using more gas.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, it's been a good debate, I think, generated by an excellent and interesting paper. Just to reiterate, the next steps are things we cannot do on our own. We cannot tackle this on our own. So the next steps both involve our partners reviewing how the research can inform the development of heat zones and heat networks in Cambridgeshire in real life, not necessarily in those 3 case studies, but certainly they may well be part of the mix. And then with our partners, including local area energy planning into the Combined Authorities Climate Action Plan, which is currently under development, and seeing how we can use the local area energy planning concept for Cambridgeshire and turn that into a reality. So much of this will involve retrofitting. We've discussed retrofitting already, and there is a general consensus, I think, among local authorities that fabric first is absolutely essential, and that we have to ensure that homes are well insulated as a key part of what we're doing here. There's no point putting green energy into leaky buildings, and so that's going to be a very key part of this process, and a very, very challenging one, I think. But we will, if you agree now, be working with our local authority partners and the combined authority to develop these important ideas further. So can I see those in favour of the recommendations, please? That's again unanimous. Thank you very much indeed, members. Thank you once again, Grace, Lizzie and Hannah, for your work on this, and to Cheryl very much for managing and steering the production of that report. Thank you enormously. Right, our next item of business then is the, yes, we have 12 minutes before we have our break that we're required to request after 2 hours. So I don't know, we're not going to take this in and complete it in 12 minutes. Would members like to take a short break now and return at 12 noon to consider this item? I think that's a sensible way to proceed. So we will adjourn the meeting until 12 noon, please. Thank you. Good afternoon now, members, because it is afternoon. So I'm going to call this meeting back to order. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 members in their places. So we are now quorate. The next item on the agenda is the Greater Cambridge Local Plan Consultation Response. So I'm going to start by inviting Colm Fitzsimons, who is the Development and Policy Manager, to present this report. Colm.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be here in person. Yeah, this paper is to brief members on where we are with the Greater Cambridge Local Plan First Proposals consultation. You'll all be aware that the local plan is being prepared jointly by South Cambs and Cambridge City Council. They've been engaged in the preparation of the plan now for probably about 3 years in various stages. This is the first formal statutory stage of the local plan process. And the purpose of the things flashing up on screens. It's the first statutory stage of that process, and the purpose of this consultation is to set out their preferred option for the scale and general location of growth across the plan period. It also goes on to generally describe the planning policies that are being prepared in the subsequent consultations, in the subsequent plan which will be published. So it gives people the opportunity to have a look at the emerging development strategy, to consider the general direction of travel which the policies are going to take. Are the themes right? Is the emphasis on various topics right? And then finally, to raise any issues which need to be considered in those policies when they are prepared at the next stage. We've undertaken some internal consultations across the county council service areas, and we've made a formal officer response, which has been submitted to the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service prior to their statutory deadline of the 13th of December last year. We've had a discussion with the Shared Planning Service. They are aware that those comments were made subject to this committee's endorsement today, although it should be stressed that under the planning regulations, they're under no obligation at the moment to accept any further comments. So it would be done we would have to leave it to them to see whether further comments are admissible under their regulations. So far, we've received responses to that internal consultation from the education teams, flood and water, minerals and waste, and the transport strategy teams. And these responses have been included in their entirety in Appendix 1 to your paper. And that appendix essentially formed the basis for our response back in December last year. Following the consideration of these consultations and everyone else who contributed to that, the Greater Cambridge Shared Partnership Shared Planning will prepare the full draft plan during the course of this year and will be subjected to further consultation before it's submitted for examination. So the recommendation you have today before you today is just simply for members to consider those responses and to give your endorsement to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Colm. Do members have any questions for Colm? Questions, please. Councillor Smith and then Councillor Milnes.
Thank you. Basically, I don't know if this is the right place to raise it, but I will do, and I'll be guided by yourself. It's basically, they're looking at the local plan, which is fine. Bringing forward new developments, again, fine, as long as they're done correctly. I'm wondering how we can get it into the consultation that we protect as much as possible existing villages as well as looking at just new ones coming along the line, whether it's new developments, new logistics sites, but it's how can we get it in there that we also protect the existing villages there's flooding issues that a lot of people are worried about, and they think that, you know, they're not protected enough. Transport issues. It's just, how can we get that in there that we protect them? It's mainly about the flooding issues that I'm not concerned about.
Thank you. Colin, would you like to take that one?
Yes, I think I can. Protection of villages, I think possibly is quite a wide-ranging issue in its own right. Clearly, when we're looking at the strategy which they're proposing, we're looking at it from the perspective of us as consultees, statutory consultees in that process. So we're looking at the development strategy, which includes development in villages, development in urban extensions and new towns. And we've looked across the board of those, and the assessments which the transport strategy team have done have taken into account the impact on transport in villages and other settlements. And similarly, for example, you've raised flooding. The floods and water team would have also considered the impact on floods, water and sewage issues within villages also. So in our role as statutory consultees, we have to bear that in mind all the time. But ultimately, it will be the plan making authorities, Greater Cambridgeshire Planning, who will determine what the final strategy will be. Generally speaking, the amount of growth going into villages is fairly limited. The bulk of the development will be focused on new sites in Cambridge, Cambridge East, North East Cambridge, intensification of the development at Edicton, new allocations at Camborne, and bringing forward a faster rate of growth at Waterbeach and Northstowe. So yes, you're right, there is a concern to protect villages, but at the same time, I think that the planning authorities are trying to get a balance, and at the moment the balance is in favour of strategic scope development rather than villages themselves.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Milnes was next.
Thank you, Chair. Just to add my declaration of interest as a South Cambs member and cabinet member, and obviously this is a matter of primary concern to all of us as district councillors, that this is an iteration of local planning that's critical. And thank you to the officer for that previous reply, because that very much summarises our position in trying to reduce the amount of development in existing villages, keep them within the development envelopes and so on, small numbers of fill-in rather than the larger new towns.
I'm not sure there was a question in that, Councillor Milnes. Did you think there was? No, right, okay, thank you. Councillor Bradnam, your question, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Fitzsimons, for your presentation of how the County Council has gone about looking at its responses. And I draw your attention to the section under education, at which the officers look at the North East Cambridge site under the heading Cambridge Urban Area, and there are no page numbers, so I'm sorry, I can't refer you to a page number. But so looking at that response at education on the North East Cambridge site, we as a county council acknowledge that formal sports playing facilities will be largely delivered off-site, and that's because of the requirement for this to be viable. It needs to be quite a dense urban development. But the County Council does say it doesn't object to that formal sports facilities will be largely delivered off-site. Whilst the council does not object to this approach, it would insist that school playing fields are located on-site to ensure that high-quality PE curriculum can be delivered without the requirement to travel. And I heartily endorse that. But I also wonder whether we can strengthen our view in any way to require that where we have, for example, county land, can we in any way, for example, the area that's being considered for formal sports provision in a general way outside the school, but I'm thinking about sports provision for the community who will live there, and indeed for the employees who will be employed there, which will come to a total of some 31,000 people in total in due course. I'm just wondering whether we can accept that some safeguarding of land for provision of formal recreation space should be encouraged, so that there should be some discussion with the local authority in consideration of safeguarding land for that purpose. And I know sites were put in by the County Council as part of the call for sites, and I would very much like us to have a conversation between the authorities about safeguarding land for provision of formal sports space, outdoor sports space. So this is for sports pitches, but also for tennis courts, netball courts, and the sort of thing that people like to do in a lunchtime from work. So it needs not to be too far away.
So I think your question, Councillor Bradnam, was whether it was possible to make that part of the representation.
To safeguard land, yeah.
Colin?
I think that's a very good point. The issue, I think, which has been taxing everyone on North East Cambridge, is it's going to be a very high density development. It's going to be a very urban development. And the reason for that is because of the costs required to relocate the Anglian water sewage works off the site and the restoration of that, or the remediation of that. So that's led to the need for high density development to pay for those enabling works which are needed for the development. The drawback with taking that high density approach, of course, is the South or the local planning authorities can't apply their usual sports and open space standards as freely as they would if it was a greenfield site such as they have at Waterbeach or Northstowe. So there is a huge amount of pressure on the land to deliver the housing, and that's why there's a suggestion here that there will be off-site sports facilities. I entirely take the point that there needs to be provision, and that is entirely a matter for the local planning authorities to deliver. The other point, I think, which is perhaps being made in this particular representation is the issue about sports facilities provided by the school. Now, generally speaking, we would always ask for the required amount of sports provision to be, or outdoor play and sports to be provided to meet the needs of the size of the school which we're providing. And I think that's something we're going to try and retain here, but we recognise we may not get the same size site which we might ordinarily have got on say, for example, a greenfield development. So there are discussions to be had, I think, with the planning authorities to see how sports provision in general and sports provision for the school will be provided off-site or on-site, or a combination of both.
Thank you, Colin. I think it would be very unfair to the residents of North East Cambridge if they were told, firstly, that they couldn't have a private vehicle, and secondly, that they couldn't have sports facility.
Thank you. And my question was whether through those discussions that Mr. Fitzsimons has referred to, whether we could consider safeguarding land for such outdoor recreation purposes.
I suppose the fact remains is if we're not providing the site or the sports provision on the site, there will need to be some compensatory land identified, safeguarded or allocated as such in the local plan. Yes, I'm quite happy to take that away and have that conversation with our colleagues. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Goldsack was next with his question.
Thank you. My question refers to section 3.1 through to 3.5. We have the same answer for each section. I guess it depends on the definitions involved. Let me give you an example. Communities at the heart of everything we do. There are no significant implications in this priority. I think we've just had a debate from Councillor Bradnam on the impact of communities and things locally. If you broaden the sense of community, then I don't believe that Ely Cathedral belongs to the people of Ely. I don't believe the river in St Neots belongs to the people of St Neots. I also don't believe that the city of Cambridge and access in and out of it belongs to the people that live in Cambridge. I think it belongs to the community of a wider area. So I would urge the officers involved to have a rethink about alignment with corporate priorities, because I believe there are some significant implications of this proposal against our corporate priorities. And I know this is the first iteration and there's more to come, so I can accept that, but I do think that's something that we need to go into in a little bit more detail. Second point, if I can please, I'd like to endorse what Councillor Bradnam has said. The reduction in school playing fields is almost criminal in my books. I think it's a terrible thing to do. And once again, we find ourselves potentially at the greed here of the development just to move the water place. And therefore, I agree with what the chairman said. I don't think she said it entirely flippantly, which is we're telling them that they're going to live in an environment without a car. Oh, and by the way, it's a hell of a long way for your sports and school facilities. That just sounds preposterous and has to be an impact on communities.
Thank you, Councillor Goldsack. Before I bring Colin back, I think there might be an issue. It's more of a technical issue with the alignment with the priorities, that this isn't a decision we're making. It's it's a decision to make a representation. And the impact on the communities and everything else will be the impact of the plan rather than the impact of our comments on the plan. But I kind of take the point. Colin.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I mean that first point about the alignment of corporate policies. I think there is a conversation starting about how we approach these particular reports. So I think probably through the chair, I'd perhaps just reserve my comments to those conversations we're shortly going to have. But I certainly take away the point which I think all members so far have made quite strongly, is the issue of the playing fields. So yes, I will certainly make that point strongly again to the shared planning service.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Smith, you wanted to come back, I think, with another
question. Thank you for allowing me to come back. I'll be brief. I was just to clarify, the big sites, proposed big sites, they do also concern villages. So it's not just little ones. They do concern the villages as well. So it's making sure that as the lead local flood authority, that we do protect them from anything. That's the point I wanted to make. It's not just sort of a one house, a two house. It's also the large developments outside of the villages concern people as well. Thank you for letting me come back.
Thank you for that. Councillor Hathorn.
There's a number of points that I'd like to be considered. Firstly, in terms of transport, and this is most obvious in terms of the North East Cambridge development, but it has parallels elsewhere. And if we're creating developments which are primarily to be where we encourage people not to have a car within a city, where we encourage people to use alternative modes of transport, there begins to become a problem with the earlier developments, such as, for example, Orchard Park and across King's Hedges and Arbury, where you do not have the same facilities for storing bicycles, cargo bikes and whatever. So I think it's about considering whether we want to at least raise the possibility of retrofitting these older developments with types of cycle storage through section 106 payments. That's point 1. Point 2 and 3 are about freight and delivery. The point 2 is about, so again, North East Cambridge is where it gave me the idea, but again, there are parallels elsewhere. If you are living in a community where you may choose not to have a car and you may be unable to drive, you still need to move stuff around. You will want stuff in your house. You might want a plant or something big. You know, how does that work? Alongside commercial delivery models delivering things to your doorstep, you need to move stuff around. So you will need things like bike trailers and cargo bikes, but it just seems crazy for everyone to be expected to have one of those. So it's looking at spaces in these developments where shared community facilities for transport and moving things around, considering that as part of the, the requirements of the development strikes me as very important. And that's in the context of there not really seeming to be a developed freight and delivery strategy, or not at the sort of micro level. The third point is that within these developments, you want to make sure that the solutions you put in place do not allow providers to have a monopoly. Some of the big retailers are very good at moving in and colonizing a space, and no one else can, put their lockers in there. So it's about making sure that solutions are open to all players in the market. So lockers would be open to different, if it was a locker storage model where you consolidate your deliveries by delivering them to a locker, all delivery providers have the same access to those lockers. My fourth point was a small point about maintenance, which was mentioned in Orchard Park, which it'd be really helpful, bearing in mind in some of the new developments you have county council, community council, and housing association lampposts and other infrastructure. If the lampposts, for example, owned by the housing association had, in the same way that county councils do, a label on them indicating to people where to go when the structure breaks down. So, if a light bulb needs changing, because these are the things that make communities, not function as well as they could if people don't know where to report problems. So it's just, building in solutions right from the start. The fifth point, is about, there's a reference to retaining affordable employment space within the plan, and that sounds like a very good idea to me. I think we just want to be absolutely sure that there are spaces for a sharing economy, for reuse and for repair. And certainly in Cambridge and South Cambridgeshire, there are not so many of those businesses as in other places. And I think it's because rents here are so high. But, making sure some of those spaces are reserved for spaces where things can be repaired, where you can keep machines where things can be repaired, I think is really important. Number 6, there's reference to access to green spaces. As the communities grow and the population grows, we don't get more swimming pools, and this, it may seem a specific thing, but it's one thing that lots of people drive a long way to, for leisure, to go swimming. So is this a big issue in terms of carbon footprint? Do we really want to be, including access to a swimming pool in the larger developments? And then finally, I'm not sure what reference there is to heat networks in the plan. I haven't had a chance to go back and look after this morning's discussion.
Thank you. As we are still in question time, I'm going to take those points as a kind of put a meta question to Colm as to whether those points are things on which we can comment, on which it would be valid for us to comment, and whether you think there's scope to do so.
They're all well-made points. Can I quickly go through them, and forgive me if I've not got them down in as much detail as perhaps I should have done. The first point, cycle storage on existing developments. I think the opportunity to secure Section 106 from other developments for those to improve the facilities which they don't have at the moment is unlikely. that would have to happen outside of the Section 106 and the planning process if we were to try and encourage storage facilities in those developments. The issues about commercial delivery space and freight strategy, I think, are very important things. These are issues which quite often come up in the quality panel, where architects are looking at developments and are saying, how is this development going to respond to the increasing trend of major national deliveries, but also, as you suggest, of micro deliveries within the localities. So that's a point we can make quite happily to the district councils to see if they can address that. Whether it comes out in policy or whether it becomes a design criteria at the later stages of planning, it would be a matter to see. The issue about maintenance assets, I think I'd probably just take that back to our asset management teams as a good suggestion. Probably can't see it working in the local plan as a policy. Affordable employment space. I think that point there, Councillor, was it's not just about big spaces, it's about the spaces for local communities, and you've mentioned sharing and reuse and repair as an example of that. So yes, that's a point we can take back. And note that there is a demand growing for green spaces, and you mentioned swimming pools as well. And again, you know, the local planning authorities should be planning either within the sites or within their own administrative areas to make provision for those larger pieces of infrastructure such as pools. Northstow's going to get a pool, which or is possibly going to get a pool. I won't commit to much more than that, which will certainly help people accessing those facilities who currently live outside Cambridge and can't use the city pools. And then finally, you suggested that there's no reference to heat networks. I will raise that as an issue and topic, and perhaps have a conversation with Cheryl outside the meeting and see if we can frame something to go back to the local authorities just to cover that one off.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Are there any more questions for Colm? Councillor Milnes.
Just following on from those helpful comments from Councillor Hathorn, I just wondered whether we could seek to comment and add something about zero or ultra low emission zones in our new development, because I don't think I've seen any reference to doing that sort of thing. So certainly North East Cambridge as a relatively small area could be designated as such, and that would assist in terms of air quality in new developments, and I think might be a helpful suggestion.
Again, something which we can certainly start a conversation going with. I mean, it's something which ourselves as transport authorities, the local authorities, the combined authority all together should be perhaps having a conversation about. Probably not sure it's something which can be put in through the local plan. I think it probably sits outside the local plan, but would certainly help deliver some of the ambition which the local plan has in terms of moving towards zero carbon, certainly in terms of transport.
Thank you very much. And another question from Councillor Bradnam.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, as Councillor Mills was raising his question, it occurred to me that we also might wonder whether, as part of our responses on the transport, with our transport responsibilities, can we make recommendations into the local plan concerning the road hierarchy and about recommendations for locations that might wisely be 20-mile-per-hour zones, for example? We know that lots of communities locally would like them, and we know we're going through a process of considering that. But I wonder whether we can comment on that in our response to the local plan as the Transport Authority, since we know it's 20-mile-per-hour zones would be very much welcomed in a lot of local residential areas.
I think probably, whilst it's slightly outside my remit, I'm kind of thinking that would be a matter for the Highway Authority ourselves to do the regulatory arrangements to deliver 20-mile-per-hour zones. What the local plan and
I think your microphone's not working. Is it possible to get it reset, Dawn?
Oh, that's great.
That
Thank
sounds
you.
better.
Yes, 20-mile-an-hour zones. I think there probably is scope for the local planning authorities, whether it's in the local plan or in design guidance, to ensure that the road hierarchies within developments are defined and designed in such a way that it can allow for an ambitious speed limit to be achieved when they come to do detailed planning. So again, it's probably a conversation I can have with them, but I'm not sure whether it can be embedded into the local plan itself.
I was wondering whether we might be prepared to express the fact that we might welcome that as an aspiration for our residential areas, both to reduce pollution, but also to make greater road safety. And if we could express that as a wish for our residential areas, that would be really helpful, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Goldsachs.
I've never got good. I just want to point out, Chair, with great respect, Emma Fitch has got a hand up, and I don't think we've seen it.
I'm so sorry, and I had totally failed to notice. Emma, you wanted to contribute.
Yes, if I may, I just thought it would be useful just to build on some of the points that Colin's done. But yes, thank you, Councillor Goldsack. I've had my hand up for a little while now. So if I can, I'll come in on a couple of points, if I may. And hopefully my internet will stay stable enough for you to be able to hear me. So first, if I touch on the flooding point that Councillor Smith raised earlier, I can confirm that the Lead Local Flood Authority will have looked at the impact of the existing developments from the new developments as well. So that's definitely will have been covered, and that's something that will get fed back. So that's, I promise, has been picked up. In relation to commercial delivery models and also the road hierarchy, that information will be covered a lot in the area action plans for each of those particular areas. And if we take North East Cambridge as an example, because you have areas that are protected, for example, for the railheads and also for existing waste uses, irrespective of Anglian water moving or not, there needs to be a separation of the HCV movements and also where the new development is going in. So that is something that the Greater Cambridgeshire planning team are already looking at. And again, that will be covered off with the road hierarchies. It wouldn't be appropriate because the outside of the planning remit for the 20 miles per hour, Colin was quite correct. That needs to be done through the separate legislation. That's the same when we're considering planning applications as well. But that is something that we can just reference in these minutes, and we can feed back to them that we want to be joined up in the way that they are doing that planning. Because I think the other thing is education colleagues, for example, are often given sites within new developments, and those sites are often done based on urban design principles and creating spaces, that often means the schools are put onto what is considered to be one of the major roads on the hierarchy. And what we're left with is a situation, for example, where the main traffic sources are going past our schools with the children in, and that's creating air quality. So again, that is something that we're feeding back on. Finally, in solutions in place for particularly the cycle parking, and making sure that any facilities that come in are capable of being used by everyone. Colleagues within Smart Journeys are working with transport assessment team and also transport policy colleagues. And again, this is something that we're looking into. So we will look to pick that up, and it comes back to the priorities for the council that Councillor Golsak picked up as well. So I promise that all of this is being covered, and if there are any specific points, I'm happy to try and support Colin. It's difficult when I'm not in the room with you all. I'd like to be there, but hopefully that answers some of the points and just gives you some extra assurances.
Thank you very much indeed, Emma, and I sincerely apologise for having overlooked your raised hand earlier. That's really helpful. Are there any more questions? I'm not seeing anyone, in which case we'll now move to the debate, which I suspect might be quite short-lived. I think most people's interventions will have been at the level of questions rather than debate on this, but the recommendations are to endorse the consultation response, which, to be clear once again, is an officer technical response to a plan that is not ours, and it has been, and that response has been submitted. So therefore, the second part of the recommendation is to delegate to the Executive Director, Place and Economy, in consultation with the Vice Chair and myself, any minor changes to be made to the response, for which we've had several suggestions already. So I'll propose that and look to the Vice Chair to second. Are there any points of debate now that members wish to add to this? I'm not seeing any hands, so I'll move then to the vote on this. Are we happy to accept those recommendations? Can I see those in favour? Thank you. That's once again unanimous. Thank you very much indeed, members. Thank you, Colin, and thank you very much, Emma. So that's now done, and we will move on to item 8, which is the finance monitoring report. So I'm hoping, thank you very much, Colin, that we will have Sarah Haywood, our strategic finance manager, to present this report virtually, and I see that Sarah is now appearing. So welcome, Sarah. Is there anything you would like to say to us about your report?
Thank you. Sorry, thank you. I was just going to do a very, very brief introduction, just to say that the bottom line for Place and Economy as a whole is showing a 52k overspend. That's on the revenue side. And on the capital side, there have been some changes in forecasts, particularly for the energy schemes. And those are actually detailed within I bring them to your attention in the covering report, but the detail is all in Appendix 6 of the actual finance monitoring report. That was my brief introduction. Thank you, Chair.
Commendably brief. Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. Are there any questions for Sarah on her report? Councillor Goldsack and then Councillor Corney.
It's very difficult when you get a report, and it's a fine report, by the way. It's very difficult when you get a report that crosses the boundaries of the remit of our committee that we're here for today. But I would welcome, as a member, some form of update on what the heck is happening with the busway litigation costs. It's huge.
Sure, that's within the remit of this committee, is it?
Well, it's in the report that's been presented to us.
It is, but the report does cover the whole of the directorate, and I'm not sure that that's something that is the remit for our committee.
Can I just explain, sorry, should I just explain the reason why? The finance monitoring correctly replicates the management structure of the county council and not the committee structure. And so it's the same. There is one report for adults and children's, there's one report for Place and Economy, which covers the 2 committee reports. And that's the best way of managing the organisation. And it's just been up, I appreciate it's difficult for members because they get the information on the partner committee, but the focus of the committee should be on the services which come under restriction of your committee.
Just follow up then. So the direction here then, Sarah, is that we should take those questions up with what I assume that would be the Highways Committee?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Corney.
Thank you, Chair. I guess the question I've got is probably over as a whole. It could be pointed at any number of topics on there, but just for to sort of pinpoint it down to one, I'll use the Park and Ride, the solar scheme at St Ives, just as a point to point out, if you like. But with the day job, obviously we've seen you know, prices escalate, and I've used that as an example because obviously that's one that's come back to this this committee to discuss the rise in prices of steel and the solar panels themselves. But I'm actually now seeing in my job and some of my colleagues that I work with in various different industries, but they're actually seeing a peak, and now prices are now dropping. So I guess it's just the question is, you know, is there some reassurance there that, you know, and I know it's quite a big ask because there's a lot of things going on, but equally, if we're not probing and asking these questions, you know, prices go up, they come down, but not everybody's necessarily always honest and tell us that they're coming down unless we ask these questions. So is there some reassurance that, you know, over whole that this is being looked at?
Sarah?
Is it worth, shall I pass to Cheryl for this? Because Cheryl knows quite the level of work goes into ensuring that we minimise all our expenditures.
Yes, that's a really helpful comment you've made. So we have seen, as you say, the rise, and especially for non-domestic materials, and we're looking forward to that drop if it's coming forward. We do work with our procurement colleagues to see and understand a bit of the market, and we work with Bouygues for them to manage procurements for competitive pricing on projects. So I'm hoping that we will see those reductions, but thank you, we will make sure we follow that up.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions for Sarah on matters related to this committee? I'm not seeing any hands, no. So I'll open the debate therefore. Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. And the recommendation is simply to review, note and comment on the report. Does anybody wish to review, note and comment further to the questions that we've already had? No, not seeing anyone. So I will take it that we have done that. I don't think we need to put that to the vote, do we? It's not a decision. So thank you very much indeed, members, for your review, notes and comments. The next item is the committee agenda plan and appointments to outside bodies and internal advisory groups and panels. So I'll hand over to Dawn Cave as our committee officer to update on these.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 2 appointments and a number of updates to the agenda plan. The first one is to appoint Councillor Gardner to the Green Investment Group in place of Councillor Jonas King. And the second one is to appoint Councillor Piers Coots as a deputy representative to the Anglian Great-Ouse Regional Flood and Coastal Committee. So if committee is happy with those appointments.
Can I just clarify that the appointment of Councillor Coots is specifically for that meeting only on the 27th of January. The system of the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee is that you can appoint a deputy permanently and also a deputy for one meeting only. So this is a one meeting only request. And it's to deputise for me. And we will also need to let the RFCC know that before their meeting next week.
No problem, Chair.
So are we happy, members, to accept those 2 nominations? Thank you very much. So changes to the agenda plan.
Yeah, there are a number. We've got coming to March a number of additions, including a request for funding from the Environment Fund, something on household waste recycling centre redevelopment. We've got slipping from the March agenda, the tree and woodland strategy, and also the North Stowe report that they'll be rescheduled to a later meeting. We've also got an item coming to March, I believe, on the private wire for North Angle Solar Farm to Swaffham Prior Community Heat Network. and we've got a number of possible papers that Sarah's just advised me about regarding low carbon heating programme, carbon valuation update and water procurement. Whether we'll see those all at the March meeting, I'm not sure, because the agenda is looking quite heavy now. But just to flag up, there are quite a number of changes, and I think it's probably best if I update the agenda plan and circulate it to committee, so you've got them all in front of you.
I was going to ask whether you could do exactly that, as there are a number of changes. So members content to receive an update by email on those? Yep. Are we all happy that we have done those things that need to be done with relation to that item? Yep. Thank you very much indeed, members. So item 10, which is our last item, is the Digital Connectivity Infrastructure Strategy Refresh and Connecting Cambridgeshire programme. And would members please note that this report has a confidential appendix which has been circulated to you separately by email. If you would like to discuss the detail that is in that confidential appendix, we will need to agree to exclude the press and public and move into confidential session, which is why this item has been placed last on the agenda. It would be good if we could discuss as much as we can in public session, and then, if required, move into private session to discuss anything that members wish to discuss within the confidential appendix. Can I see an indication of whether members are likely to want to move into private session for the confidential appendix? Councillor Hathorn, right, okay, so if you've got anything that relates to that, could you please hold back, and I will move to exclude the press and public at that point. So bearing in mind that we are still in public session, I will ask Noel Godfrey, who has joined us on Zoom, to present her report. Welcome, Noel.
Thank you, Chair. As you've highlighted, there are several different sections to this report. There's actually 3 different areas that are covered, and I propose that I'll introduce the first 2 and wait for the 3rd section, which is the confidential item. So the first 2 areas relate to, and apologies, it is a very broad area, it's a very big report overall, but the first area relates to the forward strategy that is now overseen by the Combined Authority and was approved by the Combined Authority's Housing and Communities Committee in November last year. The strategy runs from 2021 to 25. It very largely builds on the previous work of the programme, but with greater stretch targets going forward to ensure that digital connectivity meets the needs of businesses, of communities and public service delivery going forward, and that there's future-proofed solutions there. The second area relates to the superfast broadband gap funding contracts, for which the County Council is the accountable body on behalf of both Peterborough City Council and Cambridgeshire County Council. The purpose of those 2 gap funded contracts is to provide connectivity infrastructure superfast level, which is 24 megabits and up, and is now all actually being delivered as full fibre. But the purpose is to provide gap funding to deliver the infrastructure where it wouldn't be commercially viable, primarily in the more in the rural and hard to reach areas. There are 2 contracts in place, as I've mentioned, which is a result of 2 separate procurements, both with BT Openreach. Overall, the contracts have taken quite a bit longer than originally envisaged, but they've also gone much further. And in part, that was because we were able to draw on further EU and government funding. The first contract is now closing down, and as Sarah Hayward referenced in the previous item, the council's portion is £900,000 underspent. The second contract is ongoing and will complete later this year. And once both contracts have completed, there is within both of those contracts a clawback mechanism, which means that where take-up exceeds original expectations, funding is the additional excess profits, if you like, are put into an investment pot. Take up has been extraordinarily good, and there has been the clawback pot is already funded as part of the extension to the programme. It's expected that when that fund effectively matures in 23-24 financial year, that the remaining amount will be divided up amongst HM Treasury, County Council, Peterborough City Council, in line with the original investments. So that's my introduction to those first two items.
Thank you very much indeed. Do members have any questions for Noelle on those elements of her report? Councillor Mills.
Just a quick question, Chair, if I may, about the terminology and the definition of superfast, where 24 megabits per second doesn't seem particularly fast to me, and maybe this is just a function of our progression in speed rating, as it were. I mean, 4G can frequently provide 30 megabits per second, so and full fibre clearly has vastly more potential than that. And you've just referenced the fact that most of this infrastructure now will be based on fibre networks rather than copper networks. So perhaps you could comment on that. Thank you.
Noelle?
Yes, certainly, and you're absolutely correct. I mean, when the contract first started delivering in 2012, actually the very end of 2012, 24 megabits per second was a very adequate amount of connectivity for a lot of people, and now actually everybody needs a lot more than that. We are measuring the connectivity, and the contract is based on that figure, which is 24 megs and up. It doesn't mean that any of the current solutions are delivered at 24 megs. That's just a measurement that's used. And you're absolutely correct that what people need now is full fibre solutions and what's known as gigabit capable connectivity. And in fact, that's where all the new targets sit at that much higher level. Gigabit capable connectivity, typically it's about 300 megs per second, which is the measure for that. And what we can expect and what we've seen over the last decade is that those figures are always going to be rising as people need more and more bandwidth.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Gardner.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's just a very quick question. How are we going to improve the rollout of fibre to our rural villages? Because they seem to be the poor relation to the town. So I'd like to see how we're going to improve that for all our rural residents.
Actually, a big element of the programme has been very much about ensuring rural coverage. You're correct to identify that towns and cities, by and large, are covered very readily and first by commercial providers. However, we are seeing going forward a significant change to that. There's a number of operators now who are looking to roll out in the rural areas. The Superfast contract so far has very much targeted the rural areas, and going forward, set out in the strategy document actually, that the Project Gigabit programme, for which Cambridgeshire and Peterborough is a pilot area, that's very much about what's seen nationally as the final 10%, or those areas which would not get covered commercially. So there's a lot of activity that's actually happening to support connectivity in the more rural areas.
Thank you very much. Councillor Milnes and Councillor Hathorn.
Just one further question. Do we have service level agreements in place on availability? I asked that in respect to the continuing use of online meeting where availability is a key issue. And so if we've got service level agreements in our own contracts, that might go some way to assist that.
Noelle?
I'm afraid I can't comment specifically on the contractual arrangements that we have as a county council with providers. I'm quite sure we do have service level agreements within that, but that doesn't fall within the remit of our programme. So I'm not able to comment on that specifically. Generically, service delivery overall at the regulatory level is held by Ofcom, and they have the national accountability for it. But in terms of our own contractual arrangements, that sits within the IT service, and I'm not able to comment on that, although I can actually request, if you want further information, for somebody to contact you on that.
That would be very helpful. Thank you very much indeed, Noel. Councillor Hathorn.
I have a list of questions, so shall I just run through them? So in 2026, we'll see the phased closing off of the analogue phone lines. Is that something that we need to be thinking about? Is that something that having a seminar about would be worthwhile? As you know, I'm not a technical expert, and for me, it poses lots of questions. That's number one. Number two, in this strategy, there was a lot of emphasis on business. There was a light emphasis on education, and the last 2 years have demonstrated quite how important the internet access is for education. Do we have any data on what percentage of students are not able to access the internet and where they are in the county? Because I think it's really important to have that data. Connected to that, it says there's over 200 free Wi-Fi hubs, which is a great initiative. It would be really good to see where they are and identify where the gaps are for those. And also that may well tie in with the education issues. This is probably similar to Councillor Milne's questions, but his language was different from mine. You can get a fibre to everyone's door, but do we have the data on how many people are taking up the service? And also, customer service can be a real barrier to poor customer service can be a real barrier to receiving the service. And this would be the area where, in my division, there are the most complaints on social media about anything people have to engage with. It's about their broadband services. I understand that complaints go to Ofcom, but that is a real issue for connectivity if people are not getting the service. And again, is there any way in which we can get a handle on whether that really is an issue? I totally understand the point about rural access to fibre. In Histon, there's a relatively new housing development, and the 5 houses at the end of it don't have fibre. Would they be covered in this? It's these little, sometimes it could be the urban pockets or the pockets in a new development that don't have access. How do people, twist someone's arm to make them be considered within the scheme? And finally, recently a 5G phone mast there was an application for a 5G phone mast in Histon. Actually, maybe this should be for the debate, but broadly speaking, are we consulting with the district councils about the phone masts? Because the district councillors reported back that they were very nervous about this because they had no idea what was coming. That's it.
No.
Thank you. I'll respond if that's okay. Just to the individual points as you've made them, and hoping that I've actually noted them correctly. The first point was about copper switch off and what we need to do, and it is a very good question. Something that we've actually flagged and discussed with DCMS, who are the government department overseeing digital connectivity, and their response is very much that it's actually being led by providers and it's up to them to give the information. We think that is an issue because people need to be aware and they need to be prepared, and we are looking to have some further information later this year so that everybody is aware, and if they need to take any actions, whether it's in a business context for communities or indeed for public services. So that is something that's ongoing, and I agree with you, we do need to make that information available. I think your second point was about education, and again, I would agree with you. This has been a particular issue that's really been highlighted and exacerbated during the pandemic, where digital connectivity 3 years ago, pre the pandemic,
Sorry, Noel, we've temporarily lost you in a technical glitch.
But
well,
as we
turn your camera off to see whether that improves, but we've also got a problem with the TV.
Sorry, I just lost connectivity now then.
You did.
Hopefully I'm back now. I was just saying that yes,
Noel, we've now lost visual, I'm afraid, because the TVs have been switched off because they've timed out. But
okay.
I think we can still hear you. So if you'd like to carry on, that would be fine.
Okay, by all means, thank you. Sorry, I was just talking about the Education ICT Service, who were working with Department for Education to identify and provide services to provide mobile connectivity to those children who otherwise wouldn't have access. We were supporting them and giving them the information, but I don't have the statistics myself, but again, I can request that information to follow if that would be helpful. The third question, I think, was around public access Wi-Fi and where those sites are. We have those sites mapped on a web page, and I can certainly circulate that so that you can see that. You also talked about take up of services. We have only limited access to the information about who's taking up the services, and specifically we have that in relation to the gap funded contract. I can tell you that actually there's been over 77%, it's actually 76% take up of those services, so it is actually very high. In fact, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough are known for an area where there is really good take up of services, which has partly encouraged commercial providers who are now rolling out much more widely. But we do recognise that there are areas of difficulty, and particularly in relation to social housing provision, which is why within the strategy you'll note that we have targets to ensure that that social housing is covered to the same degree as market housing. I think the point about customer services and the issue of whether people are happy with the service they're getting, I think that, like you, I agree there's a lot of discontent. All we are able to do in that context is either, and something which we do very regularly, is signpost individuals to the best mechanism for making their complaint, and also to keep pressurising Ofcom to be more proactive in this area, both of which we do on an ongoing basis. Sorry, I'm trying to rush a bit. Your penultimate point was about the new housing development in Higgins, and if it's okay, I'll contact you separately about that to try and identify exactly where that is. As you say, yes, sometimes we can by pushing a bit hard, we can actually make sure that additional areas are covered, and it is exactly those small pockets that we want to try and eliminate. We don't always know where they are, so it's very good. It's very useful to have that information. The point about 5G masts is very topical. Obviously, district council planning teams have the remit to agree planning proposals, but it has been noted in the Combined Authorities Housing and Communities Committee that there are a number of members who don't feel well cited on these issues, and we will later this year be putting some seminars and information sessions, information packs together, so that members have a greater awareness of the issues in relation to 5G and the plans in relation to 5G rollout. Sorry, I believe that was all of the points. I hope I've covered them all.
Thank you very much indeed, Noel. Any further questions for Noel? Councillor Milnes.
Sorry, just one point. We had a 5G application in Sawston recently in my division, and I discovered, and I was surprised to find out that the 5G operators have permitted rights of development and were effectively allowed to position their masts wherever they liked.
The current code, the current statutory backdrop says that providers are able to deploy masts under permitted development regulations up to a certain height. Those are currently being debated and consulted on by government. So they are up to a degree, but beyond a certain, but only up to a certain point.
Yeah, and
thank you.
Just a follow-up question from me on that. Do they have to advise or inform the planning authority before they deploy their masts within permitted development rights? I was under the impression that they did.
My understanding is that they don't necessarily. It depends on the context of what they're doing. I can follow up with a written answer if that's with the detail.
Thank you very much. I think that would be very useful for members. I know I'm sure I'm not the only one other than Councillor Milnes who's had to grapple with that issue, and that would be helpful. Councillor Smith, you had a question, I think. No, right, okay, thank you. Any further questions for Noel before we move on to the debate? Right, okay. So the recommendation, and I'm taking this for the public item only, is that we note and endorse the strategy, that we note the progress of the rollout, and that we note the progress of the light blue fibre joint venture organisation. So I'll propose those and ask the Vice Chair, thank you, to second. Is there any debate for the public session on any of those? Councillor Bradnam.
Thank you, Chair. It's on the point that Councillor Haythorne made relating to the cessation of the copper network and the need for consultation, which, forgive me, the officer has said, recognised that it's important that, although this is going to be led by providers, that we need to do a piece of work with our residents, because I suspect I was unaware of this until Councillor Haythorne pointed it out in the papers. I think what I'm really worried about, and the county concern, would be that a lot of our, well, there are a number of people, but including elderly residents who won't be aware of this, but also do, I would suspect, not all of them, but many of them will rely on a copper landline. And so I think we need to do a piece of work there of communication. But also I am deeply concerned because, for me, if there's a disaster going on and there's an electrical, there's a power cut, then actually your telephone always works because it's on a copper line, unless something has happened that causes the copper line to be broken or flooded or whatever. But the point is, your mobile phone doesn't work unless you can charge it, whereas the landline is there providing the system's working. And I just do slightly worry about all this because there's a whole lot of emergency network phone calls that I imagine people might be wanting to access on a copper landline because they can't charge their mobile phone. Just wondering what the implications are there.
Right, okay.
That was a question that I meant to ask, but just you'd
Yes.
already summed up before I asked the question. Sorry.
Okay, let's go back to Noel then for an answer to that, if you can.
Certainly, I think your concern is the same as you know. We have been aware of this issue and we are quite concerned about it. It's definitely the case that there are emerging standards that require battery backup for certain solutions or recommend that. But again, that will only be for a certain period of time, and it's certainly not the same as having a copper line which at any point, you know, is currently usable. So I do think it's an issue, and it actually has become an issue in recent flooding in the autumn in certain parts of the country where they've already moved to withdraw copper lines. So I totally agree with you. I think it's a concern, and it's something we need to flag, and if necessary, make stronger representations to DCMS to make sure that they are taking those concerns seriously.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Any Councillor Ferguson?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to say that there's a huge social justice element to this for those people who live in rural communities. We're supposed to be in an area which is being called the Oxcam Arc, which is supposed to make the whole of this region a technological hub for the whole world. But increasingly, people in our rural communities don't have basic high-speed internet access, and what that means is they have reduced access to employment, because lots of us work at home these days. They have reduced access to education as well, and also, perhaps less importantly, but less access to entertainment. You see the BBC is being dismantled in favour of these streaming broadband services. So I think it's really important that our residents that live in rural communities are brought up to the same kind of opportunities that the rest of us have. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good point, well made. Councillor Hathorn was next.
Going back to the 5G phone masts, I'd just like to say that I really support the model where you have an independent third-party provider of the phone masts, so you thereby limit the number of 5G phone masts. And I would hope that, so in the parish council in Histon and Impington, you know, they had a number of areas where they thought that in discussion with the telecoms company would be great places to site these masts. And so the conversation coming down to community level, I think, is really important, as these bits of infrastructure do have an impact at that level, and just making clear to the district councils and the parish councils that you know, a strategy or more information is coming, and making it clear to them as soon as possible that there's going to be more information later in the year, so that people, you know, if it means holding back on decisions or whatever, and then being in a better position, so everyone knows what's going on, because that, I did not get the impression everyone knew what was going on at the parish council meeting this week.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Councillor Milnes.
Just a quick comment, Chair, thank you. I was very relieved to hear that we got a clawback in place based on commercial viability grounds, and interesting to see that the uptake has been sufficient to actually justify the investment in the infrastructure. So that's very pleasing to hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any further speakers in this public session, so I'm going to move to the vote on this public session and ask whether members are happy to have noted the 3 items for note in the recommendations. Can I see those in favour? Thank you. That's excellent. So as there has been a request to discuss part of the confidential appendix, thank you, Noel, in public, by the way. I'm going to move into the confidential sessions. So I'm going to move from the chair that the press and public be excluded from the meeting on the grounds that the report contains exempt information under paragraph 3 of part 1 of schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972 as amended, and that it would not be in the public interest for this information to be disclosed, and this is information relating to the financial or business affairs of any particular person, including the authority holding the information. So can I ask whether you are content for us to move into confidential session, please? Can I see those
agreed
in favour of that? That is agreed. So before we do that, I just want to thank members of the public and press who've taken the time to watch the meeting today via the council website with all its glitches. The broadcast will now end, and the committee is due to meet next on the 3rd of March.